Hey guys, sorry I am pretty late today, 12 minutes late. Sorry about that. I was just getting a bite to eat. Never let it be said that YouTubers don't work hard. I must have spent at least 3 hours writing, compiling, researching a script, easily a lot more than that. And now I'm probably going to spend maybe the same amount of time presenting it to you. 6 hours of work, it's like 3 hours back to back. So I was just getting a bite to eat, uh, before I go on. So never let it be said that YouTubers are um, sort of, I don't know, lazy, and that they don't work hard. They certainly do. Some of them do. Um, Mel Stiller, good to see you. Stephanie, you as well. Um, Good to see a lot of you guys here on a Saturday. Hope you guys are having a good weekend. So we're going to need to move quite quickly. There's a lot to get through. This episode is dealing with the King's autopsy, and as with so many things, it's controversial. So this image is, I don't think it's the last image of Elvis, but it's one of the last photos. It certainly was taken on August 16. It could have been on his way out of Graceland. In that case, it would have been late at night on August 15th. But you can see he's with Ginger. Ginger is about 20 years younger than he is. You can see even from that angle that he's quite a pudgy fellow, right? You can see he's quite sort of overweight. Yvonne Phillips is self-sacrificing, thanks. So, I wanted to show you some of the last photos. This is one of them, right? So we're going to begin once again with a couple of did you knows. Did you know that in the last 20 months of Elvis's life, he was prescribed 12,000 pills, and that he carried 3 suitcases filled with drugs with him? And I just happened to read a really good article from a journalist who was in Memphis, a British journalist, who went to the funeral, and he sort of interviewed people close to Elvis, and one of them was his bodyguard. One of those, I think, that wrote. Actually, I don't think it was one that wrote the book about him. Another bodyguard, and just asked, do you think drugs had anything to do with this? And the guy was adamant, no, drugs had nothing to do with it. So you've got to ask, did the guy just not notice Elvis carrying 3 suitcases filled with drugs with him wherever he was going? Did he just not notice it? Did he not notice any of those 12,000 pills? Did he not notice the constant traffic and a lot of the drugs that he was taking were actually prescription meds, which Elvis mistakenly believed were safe, right? Now, if you take that equation, and the weird thing while doing this research, there are some statements in the media where they'll say, in the past 20 months, it was 12,000 pills. They might sometimes say, in the last 7 months of his life. They might also say, I don't know, since the beginning of the year, whatever. So sometimes they shift that number, and it's just weird how it does shift. Anyway, we will get to that. But if we take this particular figure, 20 months is 600 days. If you sort of say the average month is 30 days, can we agree on that? And so 12,000 pills divided by 600 days is an average of 20 pills a day. How many pills do you take per day? I would say I maybe take an average of half of a pill a day. I don't necessarily take one every single day. Yeah, I don't really take vitamins at all. In fact, I prefer not to use any medication. Anyway, he was taking an average of 20 a day. And if you think about it, that's almost 1 an hour. Obviously, it's not 1 an hour. It's a handful at a time, maybe 2 or 3 times a day. But if you think about it, it really comes down to 1 pill a day every hour, almost including when you should be sleeping. So did you know that Elvis's doctor, Dr. George how do I say this? Nicopolis, also known as Dr. Nick and Dr. Feelgood, was present at Elvis's autopsy. But that's not the critical part of the information. The critical part is, did you know the contents of Elvis's stomach had been pumped out and thrown away shortly after his arrival at the hospital? Did you guys know that? Now, if you take that particular assertion and you look at what we're talking about in the poll, and you say, the poll is, why do you think Elvis's autopsy results were sealed for 50 years, right? Was it for privacy? 31% say that. For PR, 3%. I'm quite surprised to see it so low. To protect money and vested interest, 18%. I'm also quite surprised to see that so low. And then 49%, half of you are saying that it's to cover up what really happened. Now, if you think about it reminds me in a weird way of the Casey Anthony case, where the content, as far as I remember, the contents of the inside of Casey Anthony's car were sort of thrown over a fence, just sort of discarded, right? I think it was later they tried to retrieve some of it. But if you think about what could the contents of his stomach have been, well, certainly food that he'd eaten, and then also certainly in a lot of detail, in terms of the toxicology, it would have really shown just how much, how can I put it, how many pills he'd ingested, right? I think the toxicology would have to some extent shown that anyway, but you must bear in mind the toxicology, when you perform a post-mortem, it's really just finding out how much substances are in certain tissues and in the blood. But a lot of these substances have a half-life, and a lot of it can sort of dissipate. A really good way of determining to what extent there were very serious toxins would have been to examine Elvis's hair. So one wonders whether that was the case. Stephanie says it could tell a lot about time of death too. And yeah, very, very good point from Stephanie. That's a very good point. Yvonne says, I say 4. Hilarious too says, I've heard that the drugs take over your body and are in control. Well, it depends. It depends. Holly Go Lightly says, cover up. Eileen says, to which hospital was he brought? I think it was the Baptist Hospital. Stephanie says the content should have been analyzed like John Benet's were. Very good point. Pauline says, I picked money and vested interests. Sunflower says, I thought Dr. Feelgood was his dentist. No. Okay, so let's continue. Did you know when the doctor arrived at Graceland, after finding out Elvis had died, he actually crashed into the gates. He was like in a rush to get there. And he sort of kind of jumped into the ambulance. And you kind of get the sense that he felt not guilty, but he was trying very hard to save Elvis, anticipating that he was going to be in deep trouble. And he sort of did get into trouble, but we'll get to that. Now, I think it's one thing to just say, to talk about this person taking drugs. I think one's got to try and understand that, to sort of humanize it and also get a sense of the scale of it. By the way, in this image here, you can actually see that's the actual hearse. That's what the hearse looks like. Remember, we spoke about the ambulance yesterday. that was the actual hearse. And you can see that is from the Baptist hospital. So I do want to make it more personal, just so that you get a sense of proportion. And so I think the best way to understand what Elvis was doing to himself, we've got to compare it to our own experience. Now, I realize your experience is different to mine, but I still think to put it in the sort of proportions and scales and scopes of, let's just say, normal life, I presume my life is relatively normal, then you get a sense of just how out of proportion Elvis's consumption and his habits were. So in a very real sense, Elvis was doing on a daily basis, that means daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, what I did last night. What did I do last night? Well, early in the evening, I had 2 glasses of alcohol in a restaurant. It wasn't really very strong alcohol. It was sort of a champagne-like drink, but not champagne. It was sort of a fruity alcohol, kind of a citrusy alcohol, 4.5%. And this gave me a slight buzz, even though I didn't really drink very much. It was those almost a Red Bull-like can, and I had 2 of them. So it's not, even the volume wasn't really that much, but it was really quite a tasty alcoholic beverage. And I got a slight buzz from it. And then a couple of hours later, I had a cup of filter coffee at home. So the one beverage gives me a buzz, the other beverage gives me a sort of a lift, right? It perks me up, right? And then, as I say, I was stimulated by the cup of coffee, and that was sort of the point. And then many hours after that, when I wanted to go to sleep, I took half a pill, an antihistamine, which in the end didn't really do the trick. And I didn't then take another antihistamine or whatever. I just struggled through a little bit of an erratic sleep. But what you see there is a combination of something to energize or perk you up, the coffee, followed by something to settle you down, the antihistamine. And even in my experience there, it didn't quite work. It didn't sort of work like a bomb kind of thing. But I didn't have to be up for a concert. I did actually have to be up for a rugby game, which I ended up missing. But so the point is that Elvis was doing the same thing on a much bigger scale, of course, with far higher stakes and with far more people involved or on the periphery. But consider what I just told you, except that instead of 1 cup of coffee, there are 7 pills that are meant to create this up phase in the day, 7 different pills or medications. And then another 7 for generating the right vibe, and then another 6 or 7 pills for bringing him down, right? And if I had to do that in one day, I don't know. I don't know that I wouldn't need to go to the doctor. I do take that amount in just one day, just like from, let's say, tomorrow. I don't know how I would cope with that. It would be a bit of a shock. Well, he was doing that every single day. Do you think that could be bad for you? So what's quite interesting with this particular newspaper article, which looks like a local article, they talk about respiratory distress. Do you think he was in respiratory distress? I think that's accurate. And so that's what we really want to deal with, is what did actually happen. And it's going to sound a bit funny, it's both more simple and more complicated than you might imagine. Now, in January last year, the Mirror's Francis Kindon published fantastically insightful piece on Elvis's grisly autopsy, the role of constipation, and then also what he described as the hidden injury that really killed him. I wonder if any of you know what this hidden injury refers to. Any ideas from you guys? Any idea what this hidden injury that really killed him could have been? Now, it almost sounds like it's, could there have been foul play? That's not really what I'm talking about. It's kind of a medical thing. It's not that it seemed like someone had hit him with a baseball bat. That's not what I'm getting at. He had some other hidden injury. You guys know what that is. But before we get to that, just think in general terms that the baseline effect of taking 20 pills a day, every day, for 600 days in a row, the baseline effect of that, what is that going to be? Well, it's going to give Elvis serious constipation, not slight constipation, serious. And he actually was seriously constipated, not for like 1 or 2 days, but for like 4 months, right? And even before that, that was an issue. So then you say, did serious constipation have an impact on Elvis's death? Well, look at where he died. Let's see if we can bring that up. Right. This is a floor plan of Graceland, and that's the bathroom right there. This is the toilet. Looks like there's a chair over there. That's the basin. There's the shower. This is Elvis's bedroom. And I think these might be televisions. I'm not. Oh, there's the television. Yeah, I think these are also seats. But anyway, this is where it actually took place, specifically there, right? Do you think all of those pills every day for 600 days, do you think that had an impact on Elvis's death? Well, look at where he died. Look at when he died and how he died. All right. Stephanie says perforated bowel resulting from impaction. Melstella says ruptured intestine. Well, I definitely think you're going to find this illuminating this discussion. Corporal Deb, well done. Corporal Deb says, in 1967, he fell over and knocked himself out. He sustained a head injury. As far as I remember, he tripped over television cord and he knocked his head. I don't know if it was on the side of a step or whatever it was, but he knocked his head pretty badly. But just keep that statement from Corporal Deb in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to that. Stephanie says, I cannot imagine the pain of 4 months. Okay, so yeah, so he did have a brain injury, and you might say, so what? Well, we're going to sort of get to that. So here's another article from the Inquirer, and this is, look at that, hours before he died. This is, in fact, the last photo of Elvis, right? This is actually late at night. He's wearing glasses. You can see he's really quite puffed up here. And it says here, drinking cuts chance of heart attack in half. Yeah, it says major long-term medical studies reveal drinking cuts chance of heart attack in half. So it seems like they're saying, almost like they're saying they don't think it's a heart attack because Elvis drank quite a lot, I guess. I guess that's what they're trying to say. Okay. Okay, so let's continue. So this is effectively the introduction to the autopsy. So if you were asked, how did Elvis die? How would you answer? How would you answer that question? I sort of touched on it already. But if you said a drug overdose, that was stridently denied by the authorities. That was sort of the the sort of primary or the initial accusation, and that was also like, no, that definitely isn't the case. Drugs have got nothing to do with that, right? So everybody said that's not true. His bodyguards, his family, everyone said no. Even the people performing the autopsy, or I shouldn't say people, one particular person, we'll get to him in a moment. He basically said drugs have got absolutely nothing to do with this. Again, think about what we've said in the poll. But isn't there some, not all, but some truth in that, right? So, if you said heart attack, well, that's what killed his father less than 2 years later. I mean, just think about it. Less than 2 years after 42-year-old Elvis dies, his father, who's also still relatively young, also dies. And he dies of a heart attack. I think it's maybe an arrhythmia, but nevertheless, that's what it is. Elvis died in the morning of August 16, 1977, and his father, who inherited Elvis's estate, passed on June 26, 1979. And from there, his estate passed to Elvis's daughter, Lisa Marie, who went on to sue the colonel, I'd say successfully, for fraud and maladministration. Of course, Lisa Marie couldn't actually inherit anything and for another 16 years, I think. I think it was 16 years. She could only inherit when she was 25 years old, and she was 9 years old at the time. According to the Mirror, quote, the biggest insight into the star's mysterious death has come from the prominent California physician Forrest Tennant, who actually reviewed the report, that's the autopsy report, while defending Elvis's doctor, Dr. George Nikopoulos, who was later acquitted of overprescribing drugs. So I don't know, when I read that, I kind of get a mixed feeling. The one is that you've got theoretically a neutral party, a California physician, who actually saw the autopsy report, so that's important, someone who had a first-hand look at it, and that's very important. So all of that's good. The fact that he's defending Elvis's doctor is sort of, well, one doesn't really know what to make of that, but one sort of wonders, can one just defend, can one just sort of give a get out of jail free card to Elvis's doctor? And I don't know if you guys know, Elvis's doctor was, I'm not sure of the exact terminology. I'm not sure if he was indicted or charged or tried or whatever, but there were 13 other individuals that he was accused of overprescribing. 13. It wasn't just Elvis. There was also Jerry Lee Lewis and another 12 people. That's a lot of people to be doing the same thing with. And you kind of almost get the idea that the doctor became well known as he's the guy to go to if ... Does that make sense? And I really think that paragraph packs a punch. Firstly, it acknowledges the obvious, which is that Elvis's death isn't so obvious, right? It refers to the star's mysterious death. I think the less than obvious nature of Elvis's death is what gave rise to conspiracy. So I think the fact that there was some uncertainty, there still is some uncertainty, people try and fix that uncertainty. Nobody likes a vacuum. People try and answer very important, critical, meaningful questions like that, and conspiracies always rise to that occasion. Of course, conspiracies tend to be quick, easy, and convenient, but seldom completely true. So I think the conspiracy that he's not dead actually arose from the idea, buried, let's place emphasis on the idea that when he was taken out of Graceland Mansion to the hospital, he was still being resuscitated. So there was this impression that when Elvis was transferred to the ambulance, also transferred to the hospital, he was still showing signs of life. And this analysis is going to totally debunk that. It's absolutely clear that he died in that bathroom. And it's not just from one person, it's quite a few. If we go through this and you still say, I'm not sure if you've quite convinced me of that, we are going to deal with another individual, probably in a separate episode, who's very, very convincing on that. and you can, and then not just him but some others, and then we can decide whether you still want to believe in the idea that he's still alive, right? There's also truth to the notion that Elvis wasn't in the happiest place as a performer. He was not in a good place in terms of what was going on with his manager, and his record sales weren't doing too well. His recording career wasn't going so well. His concerts weren't doing too well either. And so if you thought maybe Elvis actually wanted an exit here, maybe Elvis was getting tired of everything, that's not totally untrue. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but there is some truth in that as well. So the other aspect is that while the doctor definitely overprescribed drugs and he was charged, and yet he was later acquitted, it kind of gives one a sense of a troubling lack of certainty about what's going on. So even if you just take the doctor, he's charged, then he's acquitted. So it's like, is he guilty or isn't he? Like, what is going on here? So on an arbitrary website called allthat'sinteresting.com, there's a generic explanation for what happened to Elvis. And obviously, we're going to go very specifically. We're even going to look at a detailed first-person account from Ginger, from his fiancée, like describing in minute and quite disturbing detail her finding Elvis. And that's really valuable sort of testimony. And also what his cook said, and also what his cook heard, which is also very interesting. Anyway, this generic explanation is, quote, officially Elvis Presley died of cardiac arrhythmia. That's the official cause of death. But his toxicology report also showed high levels of dilaudid, Percodan, Demerol, codeine, and Quaaludes. I don't know if you guys know, Quaaludes were actually outlawed. They were actually made illegal, I think, it was either 1984 or 1987, but sort of in the mid-80s. So basically, around about 7 years after Elvis's death, Quaaludes were taken off the market completely. And it reminds me a little bit of Vincent van Gogh, who took, why do I keep thinking it's quinine? It's not quinine. What is the substance that it's like a really, really strong form of alcohol that Vincent van Gogh also drank, and then it was outlawed in the whole of Europe? What is it again? Not quite sure why I'm drawing a bit of a blank there. Kelly Cat says Quaaludes were super strong. Yeah. Stephanie, can you remember what that thing was that he was drinking? Does it start with a... I just can't think of it. But anyway, Vincent van Gogh actually suffered a gunshot wound today. 132 years ago today. Absinthe, that's it. That is the one. Yeah. Well done for reminding me of that. So basically, more than 100 years ago, even Europe felt like, wow, we need to get rid of this really, really toxic alcohol. It's causing all sorts of serious problems and crimes. And so, about 80 years later, America says, well, we need to get rid of Quaaludes, right? And so, yeah. So on the one hand, you have certain drugs that are banned, and then you have certain other drugs that become sort of acceptable or somewhat acceptable later on. I've got to say, I wonder what is the future of cannabis, for example, because it's been legalized, but there's also evidence that the potency of it's also increasing. So you sort of wonder, can it remain legal even though it's becoming more and more potent? Anyway, so let's continue here. So again, going back to this generic description from All That's Interesting, quote, the rock star had abused a number of drugs for years, and it's believed that his addictions played a major role in his death. So all of this totally contradicts what was going on at the time, where everyone said it played no role. Oh, was he taking drugs? No, not as far as I know. So that's the one part of the generic part, that there was a lot of drugs and that he died of cardiac arrhythmia, right? So did he die of cardiac arrhythmia or did he die of drugs? And then the other dimension, also from all that's interesting, reads as follows, quote, however, his unhealthy diet may have also played a role. Known for his legendary appetite, Elvis often indulged in rich dishes. He once even flew from Memphis to Denver just so he could eat a fool's gold loaf sandwich, which involved stuffing a jar's worth of peanut butter, a jar's worth of jam, and a pound of bacon inside a hollowed out loaf of bread. So you kind of get the sense that Elvis has got quite an appetite, right? Now, I don't think, should we go to another image here? I don't think it's rocket science to say that addictions played a major role in Elvis's death. And this is the part that's important, not just Elvis's addiction and not just his addiction to prescription medication, also the Colonel's addiction to gambling. So if you say, make the statement, you say, addictions played a major role in Elvis's death. It's really that thing, addictions. It's Elvis's addiction, it's the Colonel's addiction, it's probably other addictions of people around him. The people around him were also probably very caught up in his lifestyle, also very addicted to a lot of the same things. You could just say they were caught up in partying and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Do you think Elvis was alone in his addiction? Do you think if you were Elvis's girlfriend that you would not touch a drop of alcohol, not take anything yourself, right? Addiction by its very nature means one is taking one's eye off the ball. So if you say, why couldn't this person save him? Why couldn't that person save him? Why couldn't Elvis save himself? Well, because everyone's eye was off the ball, right? Elvis was addicted to not just drugs, but also sex, also food, also fame. And while the Colonel was addicted to power and control, so if you say, how is the Colonel addicted to power and control, or are you just using grammatic license? Well, think about what is the essence of power in terms of the Colonel's story. Answer, money. Money conveys power, and it also conveyed power and control over Elvis, right? Taking a lot of Elvis's money gave the Colonel power, not only in terms of himself, but also over Elvis. Creating these opportunities for Elvis gave him also power, but also control. If you take just the control aspect as well, even the Colonel had sort of control issues. You could even say self-control issues, and that came in through his gambling, right? And gambling is also a game of power and control that I guess you play with yourself. So someone actually left a comment recently suggesting that I may be peddling or what's the word, suggesting or implying a conspiracy theory myself, that I'm kind of saying, you know what, I think the Colonel actually killed Elvis, right? And I think it's quite a good question to say, are you saying that, or what are you saying? I think it's a good question deserving a proper answer. So here's my answer. The short answer is that I think the Colonel got away with an actual murder in the Netherlands. I believe that's a real murder, right? And I think that actually emboldened the Colonel to think of himself as a master manipulator, as a marketing genius. I think he got quite arrogant. I think he got quite full of himself. I think he got a big head. I think he there was a lot of hubris. You can see it. It's written all over him. It's just his whole psychology, his whole attitude is he's just completely full of himself. He thinks he's the bee's knees kind of thing, and that's why he calls himself the snowman. He thinks he's one of the smartest people, I guess, in the world kind of thing. He thinks he's just something really, really special. He doesn't think Elvis is special. He thinks he's God's gift kind of thing. I think he actually thinks he's in a way above human beings, almost like Loki or some sort of devil who's able to pull everyone's strings, and he thinks he's very clever. But so in that sense, I think he did get away with an actual murder, but I also think he got away with murder. That saying, that person got away with murder. I think he got away with murder in a symbolic sense in America. So I think he got away with a real actual murder in the Netherlands, but he got away with a symbolic murder in America. Does that make sense? Now, imagine if the colonel was tried today. I mean, seriously, imagine this. Imagine if the colonel was tried today, like right now, for Elvis's death in a civil trial. Imagine if all of this evidence came out. I think it would put Depp versus Heard in the shade. I think social media would call for the colonel's head. If you said, social media, what do you think should happen to this guy? The question is, legally, would they have a case? And I think that is definitely a very, very interesting question. And in a very real sense, that legal question is one that we're going to sort of interrogate as we go deep into the autopsy. Because one of the questions is, who was ultimately responsible for Elvis's life and Elvis's health? Was it Elvis? Was it his doctor? Was it his manager? Or was it all of them? Could you say that any one of those three had absolutely no responsibility? Anyway, before we move on to the autopsy, I want to provide a brief glimpse of the psychopathology that lies at the root of gambling. I do think gambling is an important concept to touch on here, because I think it wasn't just the colonel that was gambling. I think Elvis was also gambling in a sense. So the colonel's gambling in a casino, and he's gambling with his star attraction, and he was gambling with what he could get away with, whatever it is he was getting away with. I think Elvis was also gambling in a sense with his health, with his life. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie, what is it? Groundhog Day, where Phil is sitting in a restaurant and he's realized that he's living the whole day over and over again, and then he just starts ordering lots and lots of food, and someone says to him, are you really going to eat that as well? What about your health? Right? And in that situation, Phil is gambling that he's going to be reset at the end of the day. Right? Do you see what I'm saying? So let's go to the psychopathology of gambling. But before we do, I just want to look at your comments here. Corporal Deb says, I think there would be an investigation into a known psychopath. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Do you mean the fact that there wasn't means he is innocent? Or do you mean if it was happening today, there would be an investigation? I'm not quite sure if I follow you. Actually says gambling is an addictive activity. As far as I know, 2% of Americans have whatever gambling disorder, or and I think it's probably at least 2%. I think if you interpret gambling in a more global sense, because they say the psychology of gambling is the same as when you open up your phone. Have you noticed I'm on Gmail, when you open up Gmail, it sort of starts with a circle that turns, which is a little bit like the pinball machine, or what is that what they call it? What do they call those machines? No, it's not pinball. It's not the jackpot machine either. What do they call them? Anyway, the slot machines. it's that same thing where those things turn, and then there's a moment of I can't think of words. There's a moment of anticipation. There's a moment of uncertainty. There's a moment of tension. There's a moment of sort of suspended, what is going to happen, and then the wheels stop, and then you know what I mean. And that spinning of the wheels is sort of what hypnotizes people. That anything could happen here. Sharon Tuck, thanks a lot for that, Sharon. Thanks for your insight. Actually says that is if one has a vulnerability or tendency, it's fun but can become out of control, for sure. Okay, so this is the psychopathology of gambling, and I want you to think about it in terms of the kernel and also in terms of Elvis. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand the basic pathology in the psychology here. The point of taking drugs is to get high, to synthetically and artificially transcend the slings and arrows of life, to float above it all, immune, impervious, invulnerable, and ecstatic. In other words, the aim of taking drugs is to escape, right? To escape reality, to escape the surly dreariness of reality, the boring, dull, thudding, monochrome nature of reality. And you want your life to become, instantly exciting and enjoyable and fun and pleasurable without actually paying the price for that. You want to just like flick a switch and feel nice, because reality can be such a downer, right? So imagine soaring like a god over the mortal plane. You take a pull and the next thing you're flying, right? Who wouldn't want to do that? Who wouldn't want to experience that? Now, gambling pretends to offer the exact same thing. Imagine if you could suddenly hit the jackpot and win $1 million. Imagine that. Like, it could happen. You could suddenly have millions, right? And in an instant, instead of the pain and effort of working, instead of being one of the schmucks out there that works a job, earns a salary, waits, and goes through all of that nonsense, instead of being stuck in the grind, instead of wasting time, instead of putting in sweat and effort like everybody else, you could somehow avoid all that. It doesn't have to be you. You could strike it lucky. You could be not like all the other schmucks. You could actually be special. And if you did strike it lucky, your windfall could mean that you could float above your mere mortals. You could travel, you could buy a house that is, some kind of mansion. You could buy a big car and sort of take your life to the next level, and you'd be unaffected by the drudgery of reality. Casinos are designed without reference points. Now let me see if I can bring up a picture of a casino. I think I've got one. Yeah. So do you have another one? I was hoping I had another picture of a casino. It looks like I don't. Anyway, do you notice this almost looks like the inside of a casino? This is inside Graceland. Look at that. Anyway, this is obviously a casino. I think I have another image here that is maybe worth looking at. I think it's a bit better. It sort of conveys what I'm sort of referring to. Sorry, I've just scrolled way too far. Yeah, this is quite a good image. So if you look at this image, right, you can see how there are no clocks anywhere. Just in this sort of thing, if you start stepping in and look at the carpet, there are sort of no reference points. Everything is almost like a mirror image of everything else. And then you can start getting lost and disorientated. Sounds are like in stereo. And there's constantly the sound of almost like a waterfall of money and, you know, bloop, 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 kind of thing. And seems like things are happening all around you, and it's quite disorientating. Lights are flashing all over the place. And it's often designed in a sort of, I don't want to say a honeycomb, but you sort of start going into the sort of labyrinth, and when you look again, you're not quite sure where's the exit. Is it that way or that way? Well, that's it's done like that on purpose. When you gamble, it's supposed to help you lose touch with reality. It's supposed to um, help, or what's the word, facilitate a lack of critical thinking, right? So where's my just lost my place here. Sorry about that. Yeah, so casinos are designed without reference points. They designed like a maze. There are no clocks inside casinos. You're never supposed to look at a clock or your watch and say, "Wow, it's late. I should leave." The idea is that it's never too late. You've got as much time as you need, and you can't tell whether it's day or night either, right? Um, so that the idea is that you go in, you lose track of reality by losing track of everything else. Time, how much you're spending, even where you are. And think about it, losing track of reality is never good. When you come out the other side, you're wearier, you're worn down, you're jaded, and you're more susceptible to wanting to avoid the accumulation of reality that's built up since your last flight from it. Now, according to the conversation.com quote, studies have shown that the release of dopamine during gambling occurs in brain areas similar to those activated by taking drugs of abuse. So the same mechanism when you take drugs is happening when you're gambling. And it goes on to say, quote, in fact, similar to drugs, repeated exposure to gambling and uncertainty produces lasting changes in the human brain. Your brain actually starts changing. It goes on to say, quote, these reward pathways, similar to those seen in individuals suffering from drug addiction, become hypersensitive. Animal studies suggest that these brain changes due to uncertainty can even enhance gamblers' cravings and desire for addictive drugs. So there's a moment of uncertainty. It's a kind of like, is the cup half empty or half full? Meaning I could be about to win. So there's this moment where maybe I'm going to lose, but maybe I'm going to win. And then maybe you lose. Well, next time, maybe I'm going to win, maybe I'm going to lose, and then you lose. Maybe I'm going to win, maybe I'm going to lose, and then you win. And that's where it catches you. I've lost, but surely I'm going to win this time. Then you lose again. Well, I've got to win the next time, right? And so repeated exposure to gambling and uncertainty can even change how you respond to losing. So most people, you would think, you lose again. I've learned my lesson. I lost. So that's it. Great. But according to this article, quote, counterintuitively, in individuals with a gambling problem, losing money comes to trigger the rewarding release of dopamine. So in other words, when they lose, they actually get like almost a joyful feeling, right? And it's almost the same feeling that you get when you win. Isn't that crazy? So like when you get into the gambling thing so far, losing actually gives you, because it's a certain outcome, gives you a little bit of a kick that is in a weird way pleasurable, and so you want that feeling again. You just want sort of a result, right? There's a little bit of that in social media when you look at your phone and there's a number there, and when you click on the thing, for a moment you don't know what that number represents, and then the screen opens and shows you, oh, I got this message or that message, right? There's a little bit of that psychology going on there. So to conclude, quote, as a result, in problem gamblers, losing sets off the urge to keep playing rather than the disappointment that might prompt you to walk away, a phenomenon known as chasing losses, end quote. You see how in certain instances, thinking irrationally is actually a kind of rational response. It sort of, it doesn't make sense, but it's a kind of, there's a science to it anyway. So anyway, the point is, do you really think one addict is able to be on the ball for another? Do you think a gambling addict is able to be on the ball for a drug addict? And now we move on to the autopsy, and I'm going to kind of frustrate you guys a little bit by saying the answer isn't in the autopsy. I'm not saying nothing is in the autopsy, but anyway, let me get to that. What are you guys saying? Roses are red. Thanks very much for that. Appreciate it. Corporal Deb says, no, I think they encourage each other. Gathering places, I get a kick if Nick leaves or likes to comment. Guys, I hope you're not addicted to me, right? I don't want to turn you guys into addicts. Mika says, I would be dubious of shrimp in the desert. Gathering places, I went to a casino and found it boring as heck. Well, good for you, but I think if you spent enough time there, a lot of people get sucked up into that. In fact, I know someone, actually I know two people that have got serious gambling problems. One is within a kilometer of me. So in my community, I know of people who, I actually know of real people who struggle with it. Tommy says, I'm a little glued to my chair. Okay. Okay, so now we go to the next section. The answer isn't in the autopsy. So the autopsy obviously is an important document. It's an important report, but I don't think this is a scenario where you absolutely need an autopsy to know the ins and outs. Now, you might say, what are you talking about? I thought this live stream is about the autopsy. Yes, it is. But the fact is, although we know some of what's in the autopsy, and we also know, in a crazy way, we know a crazy amount of detail about how Elvis was found. And we're going to go into that, like literally the position of his body and some other very descriptive information, very helpful information. But you don't need, it's not like the way to answer this, you have to absolutely have the autopsy report. You can look at Elvis's well-documented health problems. The other thing that I think you've got to bear in mind is, and I think this comes back to, I think it was Sharon who brought this up. She was like, are you saying that somebody actually murdered Elvis? So, you know, if Elvis was murdered, if he was shot or he was struck with something, then the autopsy would say that, would show that. But instead he died, I won't say of natural causes, but of things that were naturally taking place. And so all you've got to do is backtrack into those things that were naturally taking place. In other words, remember what we know from true crime, that things don't take place in a vacuum. Things in true crime, in what we know, happen inevitably, right? They're part of a pattern, and this is no different from that. So instead of looking at the autopsy and saying, well, without the autopsy, we lost, we can't do anything, you can actually just look at Elvis's well-documented health problems. It's a little bit similar to the John Benet Ramsey case, where you can say, although it's also a little bit different, but you can also say John Benet's health problems and her health reports, which were very hard to get hold of, and there's a lot of controversy around that. That's also going to give you a big insight into what actually happened, because that also, what happened to her didn't happen in a vacuum, right? Anyway, Elvis's death on August 16 wasn't a bolt out of the blue. Do you guys agree with that? It feels like that a lot of people were shocked, but it wasn't really that shocking. It was actually an inevitable drop of rain that sort of comes about after a gathering storm reaches its full extent in the heat, in the height of a summer afternoon. It's like, of course it was going to happen. That will happen eventually. According to the Mirror, quote, for Mr. Tennant, and we'll talk about him in a moment, he's the Forest Tennant, he's the California physician. One major clue was in the full body deterioration of Elvis, with almost every organ plagued by ill health. So that's kind of this guy is basically saying one of the biggest insights into what really happened to Elvis is that his health in general has declined prior to his death, and it's in almost every organ, right? Just to repeat that, one major clue was in the full body deterioration. So that's why if you say, can you see in this article here, it talks about a massive heart attack at Mansion. So if someone's got a full body deterioration, do you think one answer like he had a heart attack, do you think that is the full and final story about what happened? So in other words, what I'm trying to get at is that Elvis is gradually dying over a period of time, right? Gradually poisoning his body, corrupting and overwhelming one organ after another. And you could see that. It's not like one day Elvis was this picture of health and the next thing dead. You could see that deterioration. You could see him bloating and becoming dysfunctional in many different ways. So I don't think one can say that the visits to the hospital either are the only red flags. I don't think you can say he overdosed there, he overdosed there, and so that's what we've got, and that's the end of the story. You can go into more detail. You can say Elvis's huge prescription bill. Bear in mind, if he's got 3 suitcases filled with prescription medication, 3 suitcases. If he's taking 20 pills every single day, well, that's got to be noted somewhere. Someone's got to be ordering those medications, right? A lot of this was prescription medication. That had to come from somewhere. So that is also going to be providing you with the move to an inevitable outcome. That's part of this gathering storm. And so think about it. He was taking pills to overcome one ailment, which would then ultimately start leading to 2 more. Now, according to the Mirror, quote, as a young man, Elvis had been extremely fit, playing football and practicing martial arts. He did start abusing drugs, including amphetamines, opioids, and sedatives as a teenager. So even as a teenager, he was doing this. And he was known also as a teenager to have had an appalling diet. So that seems to show, I don't know whether he was brought up badly, whether he was neglected by his parents, where there was just a certain amount of, what's the word, a lack of education about health. You know, one sort of wonders, where does that culture of being fit and healthy come from? Should it come from parents? Should it come from what's on television? Should it come from the fast food places around you? Donna says, come on, dude, I'm going to die by the time you tell us anything. Okay, so bear in mind that Elvis was a very young star and he lost his mother. He was only 18 when he recorded My Happiness for Sun Records. So this is quite important to bear in mind, is when fame hits him, he's still very immature, right? And so he takes all those habits he has as an immature guy into his adulthood, right? He doesn't get a job and assume responsibilities. He's never got to learn that. Right? He was never taught either how to be famous or how to be mature, or for that matter, self-discipline. In fact, he was conditioned to believe the opposite. Think about it. Not that less is more, but that more is more. Excess is good in everything. Excess begets excess. When gambling in excess, the byproduct is excessive debt. When taking a huge amount of prescription pills, especially the type and amount Elvis was taking, the byproduct is constipation, a nice word for stuck excrement. Debt and feces are both a kind of prelude, a precursor to death. So for who was it that said they're going to die before I finish up here? Donna, I'm going to read 2 more paragraphs, then we're going to deal with Ginger's discovery, right? So I hear you. So this is another reference to how much he was consuming. Quote, the singer was also on a cocktail of drugs that had been prescribed, almost 9,000 pills, vials, and injections in the 7 months before his death. So do you see, this is now another figure. You may recall that our earlier per average number for pills over a 600-day or 20-month period was 20, right? Now, 9,000 pills, vials, and injections comes to an average of 43 individual treatments per day. That's roughly 2 per hour every hour. That's double the 1 pill an hour figure when we track back 20 months. So we can see that in the last 6 months or so of Elvis's life, anxiety and insomnia were looming large, and Elvis soothed these with yet more drugs. So we're about to deal with Ginger finding him, and now I've got a question for you. What do you think was fueling Elvis's unusual levels of stress and distress in the summer of 1977, and in particular the month of August? Let me ask you that again. So we've now proved, we've shown that he was consuming a huge amount of prescription drugs in the 20 months prior, but in the 6 months prior, he actually doubled his intake. So what is going on? Why is he getting more and more stressed? Why is he getting more and more distressed? And why, in particular, in the month of August? And you could also ask, why did he die in August and not some other time? What's the relevance of the time, the timing of his death? Do you guys know what the answer is? Stephanie says, I know, thanks to Nick's post. Thanks for keeping that. There we go. Well done, Zircon. Was it the book? Yes, a book was coming out there. And we know, a book takes a while to come out. It's like I'm writing a book about you, or, it's in the news, X, Y, and Z are writing a tell all about Elvis, and it's in this magazine. So it's sort of announced before the time, and then there's this countdown, and it takes weeks and months for it to sort of happen, right? So it's like also almost like that gambling thing. Am I going to lose? Is it going to be a nice story about me, or is it going to be a horrible story about me? Given that I've fired these guys, what are the chances that it's going to be a good story? What is going to happen to my life? Am I going to lose my fiance? Am I going to be sued? Is my career going to be over? What is going to happen? Yeah. So well said, Axie. Yes, that damn book. That is exactly what he thought, what his father thought, and what the colonel thought, right? So yeah, the answer is the Three Bodyguards book that was coming out right then. So I don't know if you guys know, it was published 4 days before his death, and an article about the book came out on the day of his death. That's how current it was. After Elvis died, a certain publication ordered 2 million copies. So yeah. Okay, so now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. Ginger, his fiancée, describes a grisly discovery. Did you know that Elvis proposed to Ginger Alden in the bathroom of Graceland? I actually found the date. I think it was the 26th of January. But did you know that he actually proposed to Ginger in the bathroom? The same bathroom where she found him lifeless a few months later. So now we go to the Mirror, which provides these excerpts from a book that she wrote about this particular moment. Quote, "It was his girlfriend Ginger Alden who found the rock and roll star's body with his pajama bottoms around his ankles and his bottom in the air." Now we go to the Express, quote, and this is quoting from her book. Ginger recalled, quote, "The last thing Elvis said to me was after I told him not to fall asleep." So this is really important. What were Elvis's last words? Do they tell us anything? And so she says to him, "Don't fall asleep in the bathroom." And why would she think about that? Because she knows what he's just done. She knows he's just taken basically sleeping pills, downers, right? And it also makes you wonder, had he fallen asleep in the bath in other places before? And she said that he responded, "I won't." I've seen some versions of his last words being, "Okay, I won't." And then he turns, according to Ginger, he gave her a little wave. And then he walked into the bathroom. And she says, "I found him a little while later." Ginger woke up around 2 p.m., realized she was alone, noticed the bathroom door cracked open a little. I didn't actually know that. I didn't realize the bathroom door wasn't actually fully closed or even locked. It was actually slightly open. So do you remember yesterday we saw that Ginger called her mother and put on her makeup prior to finding Elvis? That's not in this particular article. Now we're going to go to a much more detailed version of this, also from Ginger. So she apparently later wrote the following: "I knocked on the door." So when she wakes up after all of this, she knocks on the door and she said, "Elvis?" And there was no answer. Then she says she slowly opened the door, peered in. Bear in mind, you know, he could have gone to the bathroom, slept, and then when she woke up, or not when she woke up, just before she woke up, he could have gotten up and went back to the bathroom, kind of thing. Anyway, so she peers in, and there she sees Elvis on the floor. She says, "I stood paralyzed. Elvis looked as if his entire body had completely frozen in a seated position, then fallen forward." So I'm going to provide that description just so that you guys no, this was at 2 p.m. He went into the bathroom at about 9 a.m. Sorry, yeah, 2 p.m. So I'm just going to highlight that. So what I want to ask you is, in your mind, how do you imagine this? Because there are a couple of possibilities. The one possibility is Elvis, how close is Elvis to the toilet? I actually saw a description somewhere where they said Elvis fell on the floor, then crawled to the door, and then he died sort of there. That's one description, which I don't believe is accurate. How do you guys imagine from this description he was lying there, right? Do you imagine any part of his body is touching the toilet? Do you imagine he's a few feet from the toilet? Do you imagine he's lying on his side? How do you imagine it? Mika Kaplan says that means rigor mortis had set in. Yeah, gathering places, how embarrassing. Julie says the toilet is directly above the columns of the house he loved so much. Yeah, we're gonna. Well, let me show you where it was. So that's Graceland. That is the bedroom over here. That is Elvis's bedroom. That is where. Let me just make it a bit bigger. That is where. That's where Ginger was sleeping, and the bathroom is actually there. The toilet is sort of in this area. So let's see if we can bring up a graphic of, there it is. So can you see there are the columns? Let's bring it up. Can I not move this? Let's just do that. So there are the columns of the mansion. There's the window. And so right behind that window is where Elvis was actually found. Is found right there. I wouldn't say it's where this cross is. I think it's there. In other words, right by the toilet, right? So right sort of over there. Okay. Pauline says a room with a view. Mel Stiller says very undignified. Bilby says feet touching the toilet perhaps. Ale Grenade says, was there blood in the toilet? It's a good question. So anyway, you've got to ask, had he died in a sitting position on the toilet and then eventually fallen forward, or did he fall forward in death? Had he in fact fallen asleep in a sitting position and then died in his sleep? So in other words, his last words to Ginger were, okay, I'm not going to fall asleep on the toilet. But did he actually fall asleep on the toilet? So he falls asleep, and then in the sitting position, more and more pressure is brought to bear on his bowels, on his heart, and so while he's asleep, he actually dies. In other words, he dies in his sleep. That's a question, right? And another theory is that as he sat down, as he was sitting down on the commode, this pressure on his heart closed his heart effectively. The pressure, the constipation sort of pushed back into his body. So in that motion of sitting down, that caused him to have a heart attack or whatever it was that killed him. So the question is, was he sitting and fell asleep and died, or in other words, a very passive scenario, or in the act of sitting down, did that create this terrible pressure inside his body, right? Almost like this balloon that is already blown up quite a lot, and now it's pressure's being exerted on it even more, right? So I'm going to go to this description. His legs were bent. This is Ginger's description. His legs were bent. The upper part of his chest and shoulders touched the ground. Now, what does that tell you? If it says the upper part of his chest and shoulders touched the ground, it means the lower part didn't. And how can you be lying on the ground, but only the upper part of your chest is on the ground? Are you starting to see the picture now? So let me post this let me post this so you guys can see it. So there it is. His legs were bent. The upper part of his chest and shoulders touch the ground. So imagine both his shoulders are touching the ground. It's not just one shoulder, it's both, right? So both shoulders are touching the ground. Where do you think his chin was? Where do you think his nose was? Where do you think his arms were? His head was slightly turned to the left with his cheek resting on the floor. So he's kind of got his face on the floor, right? It's not that his head is totally turned to the left, it's slightly turned to the left, right? And then the question is, so was his abdomen in the air, right? If that's the case, where were his hips and pelvis? And so you ask, was he on the floor, was he on the toilet, or partially on both? What do you think the answer is to that? I'm going to put that in, put that up for you guys to think about. Was he on the floor, was he on the toilet, or partially on both? Mel Stiller says he collapsed onto his face. That's true. Axie says, I think his belly was cramped badly and his legs drew up in response. Mika Kaplan says he clearly didn't try to brace the fall, so he was asleep or dead when he fell. That's very true. That's very true. You can definitely assume from that, and we're going to get to that in a moment, where were his arms when all this happened, right? So if his arms were, if the palms of his hands were like this, right? If he was found with the palms of his hands kind of bracing himself and kind of against the floor, in other words, the floor was, if this book is the floor and his hand was like that against the floor, you could imagine that he was bracing the fall against the floor. And how do you think his hands were ultimately? Corin Levi, greetings from Geneva. Couldn't sleep and was delighted to catch you guys live. Welcome, Karen. Yvonne Phillips says, for him to be in such an unusual position on the floor means he died while sitting on the toilet and fell forward later. Yeah, so that's definitely a good point, but we need to think about it a little bit more. Julie says, did he try to save himself with his hands or arms? That's the question. Corporal Deb says, I think he was on the floor. His whole body was on the floor, his palms close to his body. Well, that's not what she describes. She says the upper part of his chest and shoulders touched the ground, and his head was slightly turned to the left. So his head's on the floor, his shoulders are on the floor. The upper part of it, only the upper part of his chest is on the floor. Remember the mirror describing it as his pajama bottoms around his ankles and his bottom in the air. So it's an extremely undignified position. And you know what, I don't think anyone has ever sort of animated it or acted it out or demonstrated it because it's quite horrifying in a way. You know, you can imagine it, I guess, but can you think of anyone who's actually illustrated it? I think Ginger does describe it with words, which is basically a written illustration. Does that make sense? So anyway, she goes on to say, and this is again quoting from the Mirror, Ginger was just 21 at the time, so she was 21 years younger than Elvis, I think. Anyway, she wrote in her memoir, quote, his arms lay on the ground, close to his sides, palms facing upward. She adds that it was clear that from the moment he landed on the floor, Elvis hadn't moved. So Elvis didn't fall on the ground, wake up, and sort of put an elbow up or put a hand by his face or, you know, maybe get hair out of his eyes or something. He basically fell forward and he stayed in that position. So that's another description. Morningstar says he died, nerves jumped, stomach swelled up, he fell off, his head was slightly turned, part of chest touched the floor. Actually says, I thought the doctor tried to describe it. I think that's also, we're going to get to that. Thanks a lot, Ricardo. Thanks a lot for that. Corporal Deb says he was dead before he hit the ground. It does seem that way. It does seem that way. So that's now giving you a big clue. How did he actually die? How do you die swiftly? And that raises a really, really interesting counter to the drug narrative. If you die of a drug overdose, you don't die suddenly, right? I think my only problem with this idea of he died suddenly is you could argue that he actually died sitting. In other words, he was in a sitting position and then he died. You could also argue that he was in a sitting position, he fell asleep, and then he died. In other words, that he didn't die suddenly. And then after he died, when the what's the word? When the blood started pooling in different parts of his body, for example, going down his legs or whatever, that may have drawn his body forward, and so you could also argue in that scenario that he died much later. Sorry, not that he died, that he fell over much later. Can you see how both those explanations actually work in theory? I don't like the explanation that he sat down and fell asleep, because I don't know, I guess you'd have to sit on a toilet and see how easily you could remain propped in that position. I do know that fat people, more overweight people, tend to be propped up by their cushioning far more than, for example, a very slim person. So I don't know whether that's a factor. Again, one would need to sort of act it out to sort of see. I know the palms were facing up, so he was sort of like that. Okay. So my impression from this is that Elvis fell directly from the toilet forward onto the floor. So in other words, when he was found, he was sort of kind of half on the toilet. In other words, his pelvis was still on the floor, but his chest, so his pelvis was still on the toilet, but his chest wasn't. His chest was on the floor, if that makes sense. So she goes on to say the following, and your heart's got to go out to her, this young 21-year-old presented with this scene, you know. She says, and she's engaged to him as well. She says, I rushed over, bent down beside him and said, Elvis, a horrible fear shot through me. His pajama top, he was wearing gold pajamas. His pajama top had slid forward a little. So that also sketches out that his torso is bent downwards, which is causing his pajama top to slip downwards, right? The wrong direction in a way. You know, you imagine it should slip down, but now it's slipping forward. She says, I touched his lower back. Obviously, his lower back's exposed. His skin felt cool. Bear in mind, this was midsummer. In a way, you'd expect her to say it felt cold, but it is midsummer. She goes on to say, I gently turned his face toward me. A hint of air expelled from his nose. The tip of his tongue was clenched between his teeth, and his face was blotchy. That's really a incredibly detailed graphic explanation. More than I was quite shocked when I read it. I was quite surprised that it was so detailed. It's a very good point from Julie. Very good point. She says this could explain his nose looking different in his coffin. Yeah, that's a very good point. I know that was the source of a lot of conspiracy theories, but if you know the facts, if you know this information, for example, well, then it makes complete sense, doesn't it? So I just want to add the second part of that statement. His skin felt cool. I gently turned his face toward me. A hint of air expelled from his nose. The tip of his tongue was clenched between his teeth, and his face was blotchy. Now, I think one's also got to and I'm not a pathology expert, but one's also got to ask, what is the typical classical response to certain, I guess, pathologies, to certain, like, do people typically clench, bite their tongues when they have heart attacks? I don't know what the answer is to that. Is that a typical thing? Or does his tongue extend through his teeth post-mortem, right? Yeah, blotchy as in blood pooling. Okay, so this is from Ginger Alden's, I think it's a biography or a memoir on Elvis. And so Stephanie's touched on it. The blotchiness indicates lividity, which suggests Elvis had died sometime earlier. So just from a description, we can say with quite a big degree of certainty that this happened very early on. It didn't happen 5 minutes earlier, it didn't happen 10 minutes earlier. It probably happened more than an hour earlier, and it very likely happened 3, 4, even more hours earlier, right? Liver mortis typically sets in from about 30 minutes to 4 hours after death. So he'd been lying like that for at least 30 minutes, but probably longer. When Ginger writes about the horrible fear in her memoir, although she doesn't articulate what the horrible fear was, well, we know what it was. It was that she was afraid that Elvis had died. And I say this with sadness and with sympathy. I think the scene that she was presented with, to her, Elvis looked dead, and indeed he was dead. But she wished he wasn't, and so did everyone else. According to Wikipedia, quote, Elvis's face was rigid to the point that mouth-to-mouth resuscitation was impossible. So there you have another description that his mouth was immovable, which means also he'd been in that position for a really long time. And this rigidity was described by Joe Esposito. What we also know is that Elvis had turned blue, his face was blue, and that's according to Nancy Rooks's testimony. She said, I heard a loud noise upstairs between 9:30 and 10 a.m., right? That's about 4 hours before Elvis's body was finally discovered, right? Now, that loud noise, was that loud noise Elvis hitting the floor, right? Because obviously he did hit the floor quite hard if he didn't stop himself. Now, you can also imagine, again, looking at this building, it looks like quite an old building. Does it have wooden floors? So I don't know if any of you here visited Graceland. Is there anyone here that has actually visited Graceland? Bilby says, was the floor carpeted? I actually don't know. Corporal Deb says the noise was Elvis hitting the floor. Well, that's what we're trying to determine. If the entire building was sort of concrete, then I'm not saying you wouldn't know that, but it would be harder. But certainly in old buildings, often the interior is woody, made of wooden floors and that kind of thing. So those of you who have been to Graceland, were there any wooden floors that you walked over? Do you remember? Actually says tiled. Ale Granada says, she said it was the tip of his tongue sticking out, not the whole thing. Not sure if that matters, but if the mouth was open, the after the rigger hit, jaw clenched. It could appear. It could. Yeah, I agree with you that it could appear that he bit his tongue. I don't get the sense that his tongue was protruding. I just get the sense that they could see his teeth and his tongue there, and it was just the tip of his tongue. Julie says best part of 20 stone hitting the floor. Mel Stiller says he probably had marble floors. Well, we want to know the answer for sure. Wall to shag carpet from the era. So anyway, you just want to think about, could it be possible that somebody did hear this thud? And if you say, I believe it, I think she did hear this thud, then you've got to ask, why didn't his fiancée hear it, right? Why didn't Ginger hear anything? I mean, the door wasn't even closed. Why didn't she hear this loud thud? Did she take a sleeping pill? So there's another testimony from Nurse Marion Cock, that's Cocke, Marion, Marion, and she said it was so evident he had been gone a long time. So if you are trying to figure this out, if you're saying, did he die the moment he sat down, meaning in the motion of sitting down, then this gives some credence to that. This idea that he'd died, he'd been dead for a long time. That's also what, as Stephanie said earlier, pumping his stomach prevented people from, and getting rid of the contents, prevented people from determining a very accurate time of death, right? Liesl McGuire says, yes, I have visited Graceland. It's amazing, gaudy, but creativity in every corner. So Liesl, do you remember when you walked over the floor, did you walk upstairs? Was there creaking of wood? Do you remember any of the floors having wood on them? While we on Graceland, let's look at a couple of pictures of Graceland. So there's the jungle room. I think there's supposed to be a waterfall over here. There are some TVs, but they're pretty old TVs. They actually say that Elvis would watch 3 TVs at once. Although that seems crazy. I mean, today it's not unusual for certain people to have 3 or 4 monitors, computer monitors. So in a way, Elvis was ahead of his time. What do you think the floor is made of over here? Sharon Tuck says upstairs was off limits. We're going to touch on that in a moment. Sharon Tuck says every room had different flooring, but do you remember if you could hear yourself, you could hear, like you could feel the creak of wood in any of the rooms? Do you remember that? Tommy says, I just gave a link to pictures of the bathroom. Where are they, Tommy? I don't see the link. I don't see the link. If you put it there, I don't see it. So here's another picture, and there you can see it's marble floor with sort of carpet around the edge. Ale Granada says, I just Googled and it looks like carpet on all the bathroom floors. Sharon says, no Nick, black tile in the bathroom is my guess. Okay, I did read that. Bilby says, carpet in the bathroom was height of luxury back then. Well, you do see a lot of carpet in the in a lot of the rooms, so I think possibly there was a carpet. Okay. So what about the air expelling from his nose? What do you think that means? Right? And I think that also means, um, suppose there's also another way of interpreting it. You could say that if air was trapped inside of his body, it maybe means that he wasn't lying there for very long. Otherwise, it could have just escaped. But another explanation is that it could mean that Elvis died very suddenly, meaning the following: he didn't breathe his last. It wasn't like he was breathing and then he sort of died and he just went, right? If that occurred, air would have naturally sort of sighed out of his body. Instead, he suddenly died, right? So now you've got to go back and ask, like a medical professional, if you die of a heart attack, are you going to sort of die so suddenly that you're not going to breathe your last? I mean, surely a heart attack isn't even that sudden. It's sort of a couple of seconds, but right. So now again, you've got to address, what does this mean? The air expelling from his nose, because it means he'd sort of taken a breath, or there was oxygen in his lungs still, right? So it does seem to suggest that he died suddenly. Does it mean that when he sat down, he died? That suddenly something compressed inside his body and something kind of popped, right? The air could also be related to other gases remaining trapped in the flaccid form in front of Ginger. And then she goes on to provide even more detail. She says, I gently raised one eyelid. His eye was staring straight ahead and blood red, right? This, I think, also indicates the likelihood that Elvis had been deceased for some time, hours rather than minutes. Two additional aspects not mentioned in these descriptions, which I suspect were obvious, were likely A, the smell in the bathroom when Ginger opened the door, bearing in mind it was midsummer in Mississippi, and B, that rigor had likely set in. So getting Elvis into an ambulance, I'm not sure if he was necessarily able to lie completely down. One imagines he was locked in a sort of hunched up position. So now we're going to deal with the rushed autopsy. Before we do, I want to mention something else before it slips my mind. Let's have a look at some of your comments here. Actually says, I have a picture of the bathroom. How can I send it to you? I think get Stephanie's details and maybe Stephanie can email it to me. I don't know. Maybe we can do it that way. Corporal Deb says they put him in the ambulance in his current state. Yeah. I just had a thought, but it sort of came and then it went as well. So Stephanie says, Peter Garolnik says, Warlick found a stain on the bathroom carpeting too. Wonder what kind of stain that was. So yeah, this was my thought. If you know true crime, and you've read a couple of autopsies, then you know that it's quite common for cadavers to release urine sometimes and also excrement. So one wonders, did that happen with Elvis? Was his constipation such that he still didn't, or did he? Just, I think, something that's kind of interesting. It's a little bit macabre, but one wonders what was the case there. Okay, so let's continue. So, according to Wikipedia, quote, while an autopsy undertaken the same day Presley died was still in progress. So while the autopsy is still being conducted, the Memphis medical examiner, a guy called Jerry Francisco, announced the immediate cause of death. So let me ask you, do you think there's something irregular about that? Do you think that while they're still doing the autopsy, never mind writing the report. I mean, a lot of you guys know in true crime, there's often quite a few days that pass. A crime is committed, an autopsy is undertaken, and then it's released, right? So the same day Elvis died, so in other words, he died or he was sort of, let's say he died at, how can I put it? His death was known by the first person by about 2 o'clock, 2:10. That same day, his autopsy results were announced, the same day. And while the autopsy was actually being conducted, right? Do you find anything sinister or strange about that? The speed, the haste, in fact, of that. And I think there's another thing to consider is, did Jerry Francisco sort of jump the gun? And what I mean is, while certain people were caught up and busy with the autopsy, was there pressure, was there some kind of incentive to have this one particular person announced to the media? The media are desperate to know what happened, and so you have someone that make an announcement, but it's not what his colleagues are seeing or saying. In other words, it's an opportunity while his colleagues are doing something else for him to jump the gun, for him to get ahead of the sort of media narrative, right? Just think about it like that. And so he makes this initial announcement. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. Let's quickly find that newspaper article there. Well, there it talks about heart attack. And let's see if we can find another one that dies apparently after heart attack. So that's kind of also showing a little bit of uncertainty. And this was published Wednesday morning, August 17th. That's how quickly everyone is supposed to know. Right? So Jerry Francisco says it was a cardiac arrest, and it's like, no doubt. It's not, we think, it's not, maybe, it's not, it's kind of absolutely, he's sort of adamant, is very clear on what it is. It's very black and white. He died of cardiac arrest, right? And then he was asked, were drugs involved? And then he said, again, a very strident, clear, crystal clear, no. Drugs played no role in Presley's death. And that's why you say, jeepers, that doesn't seem quite right. It doesn't seem quite right that you can be so clear, so certain, so soon. I mean, at this point, the toxicology wasn't even out, right? And bear in mind, at the hospital where the autopsy was being conducted was the same hospital that a runner had picked up medication for Elvis hours earlier. Did the hospital not know that? Let's bring that up. Asked if drugs were involved. No, they played no role in Presley's death. And this is why you say, well, can you trust that? Can you trust that? And then you say, why would he lie? And then it brings us back to the poll. why do you think Elvis's autopsy results were, you could either say sealed, or you could say, why is something going on with these autopsy results? Why is there this uncertainty, this sinister aspect to it? Is it because of privacy? I don't think what this guy said was because of privacy. I mean, you could say that certain people wanted the information to remain private, but that's not the main reason. Was it for public relations? I think that's a big part of it. Only 4% of you say that, but I think a lot of Elvis's life was PR. This is a PR nightmare. To protect money and vested interest, that's sort of part of the PR. That's what PR is all about, to protect the money and vested interest. I kind of wanted to also say all of the above, but I think the main reason for this was to cover up what really happened. Someone decided we can't tell people what really happened to Elvis here. It's too terrible. It's too horrible. It's too terrible. Stephanie says, I said PR. Stephanie, you might have been the only one, but I think PR is one of the best answers there. Okay. So, as I said, it's a really strong statement really early on. I think drugs did play a role in Elvis's death. I don't know what you guys think. I think they definitely did play a role. Moreover, I think this was a scenario of contraindications and drugs interacting. I'd love to know what Stephanie says about this, because Stephanie's got some experience in this area. But I would love to know how you sort of explain, when you're taking huge amounts of medication, what is the main concern? Contraindications or the drugs interacting? Or is it a sort of unknowable combination of both of them? Let me say that again. So, like, if you're taking 20 pills a day, is your concern going to be, as someone performing the autopsy or the doctor that's prescribing, is your concern going to be contraindications or the drugs interacting with one another? Which one is it going to be more? So I'd be interested to see what Stephanie says about that. And I think it may be true that Elvis did die of a violent heart attack. In other words, he didn't just have a heart attack. You hear of different scales of heart attack. A friend of mine actually had a mild heart attack last year. You can have and I've heard of someone who had a heart attack and she didn't actually know it. So I met an athlete who was doing a really long race, and she had I think they called it a silent heart attack. You can have a silent heart attack, you can have a mild heart attack, and you can have a violent heart attack. And so I think it's possible Elvis did have a violent heart attack. I think it's possible. But I think even if that's the case, you've still got to ask what caused the heart attack. And you might say drugs caused the heart attack, and it's possible they did, but I think it's probable they only did so indirectly. And again, I wonder what Stephanie says about that. What I mean is, if you had an underlying condition of constipation going on for months, then you had an uptick of downers, further complicating, worsening and exacerbating the constipation. So I think you've got to see the underlying condition as part of the equation. You've got to see the drugs as another part of the equation, and then the heart attack as the final part of that equation, right? So let me just see if Stephanie's responded. Stephanie says, interesting, both. Pharmacy will have to bypass contraindications and drug interactions to fill a prescription in the first place. So do you think, I know you maybe don't know Elvis's medical history off by heart, but if you think about what we know about him, do you think that he was actually experiencing contraindications anyway? Do you think he was experiencing drug interactions anyway? I mean, prior to this taking place? Yeah, Tommy says it doesn't sell records. Well said. Liesel says, I think he was very over medicated. Mika says it was kind of a perfect storm. Yeah. Corporal Deb says Dr. Nick would have written a prescription anyway. Yeah. Okay, so I don't think it's medical rocket science to say that there is a direct causal link between severe constipation and cardiovascular risk, right? I wonder whether Stephanie agrees with me when I say that there is a direct causal link uh, between severe constipation and cardiovascular risk. We know Elvis was at risk because of inherited heart problems. We also know that he had very high blood pressure. We know that he was overweight, eating badly. The combination of polypharmacy, I don't know if you've heard of that term, Stephanie, but the combination of polypharmacy and constipation, this straining against a stool, could easily have triggered severe congestive heart failure, perhaps even multiple organ failure. So the mechanism or equation appears to be as follows. And so I've kind of made a little thing here. See if you guys agree with it. Massive amounts of pills, constipation, heart attack, death. That's the sort of equation. So if you say, did Elvis die because of drugs? No, but they were a factor. Did he die because he was constipated? No, but they were a factor. Did he die because of a heart attack? Yes, but that was brought on by the constipation and the massive amount of pills. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So that's why it's quite a complicated answer. But yeah, okay. So would you say Elvis Presley's manner of death is natural or accidental? Right? So knowing what we know, would you say Elvis Presley's death is natural or accidental? So I would submit that it's a combination. It's a combination of it being natural, like it's not, how can I say, it's not unnatural in the sense of someone shooting him or someone injecting him with a substance without him knowing it. Although having said that, it's hardly natural what he was doing. And what happened was hardly accidental either. It seemed inevitable. But I think you've got to almost imagine if this was being heard in court and you have to say, okay, we've got to classify the manner of Elvis's death. Did he die of natural causes? Right? And that doesn't feel right. Then can you say, did he die accidentally? That feels more accurate, but it also doesn't feel completely right, does it? How do you classify this? Um, he seems, it seems to touch, it also seems to touch on suicide or homicide. It feels like elements of his death feel to some extent suicidal, although I don't think Elvis was suicidal, but it feels like elements of it was. It was a little bit self-destructive or reckless at best. And elements also feel a bit like homicide in the sense of negligence from certain other people that could have helped him, should have helped him. I'm not saying they are 100% to blame, but they are not completely blameless, right? That doesn't mean they are legally liable, though. It just means that they're probably morally culpable, if that makes sense. So I'm merely suggesting that it feels like that is part of it, if you get my meaning. One additional reason for this is because Elvis's death and cause of death was covered up, leading to suspicion. So if you say, you know what, I think Elvis died because of his own bad choices, it's just as simple as that. Well, then why has so much been covered up? And I think I'm gonna astound some of you when we deal with one aspect of the cover up that I think none of you have thought about. And I only discovered it researching this episode. Yeah, there were a lot of risk factors. True Jedi Forever says, but an addict isn't always accepting of the damaging behavior or denial. Yeah, I mean, the fact that someone's an addict is another aspect of the conversation. Any addict, by his very nature, has lost a certain measure of control and to some extent responsibility. And then the responsibility, I suppose you could argue, shifts to someone else, but not really. I mean, who's ultimately responsible for you when you're an adult, right? That's a great point, and it's one I bring up later on. Elvis, Michael Jackson, Prince, all gone way too soon, all gone in actually a similar way. Okay, so I don't think there's any doubt about the vital aspects of his death were covered up, but I think there's an exaggerated sense that there was some nefarious plot or conspiracy. I don't know if there's anyone here that thinks that there's something really nefarious going on. But that's not to say there wasn't anything dishonest or nefarious going on. So I'm saying there wasn't a big conspiracy like a lot of people believe, but there's some truth in that there was something dishonest and nefarious going on. You get my meaning? Because we know the colonel has skeletons in his closet and that he meant to keep them there. And we know that Elvis did too. We know that Elvis didn't want this book coming out because it was going to reveal certain things that didn't reflect on Elvis as this perfect model of society. So, what was the real reason people wanted to conceal the truth about Elvis? Well, it was quite simple: PR, to protect Elvis's reputation so that he could continue to make money. Brianna, I don't think so. I don't think so. Do you guys agree with that? The real reason people wanted to conceal the truth about Elvis was public relations, so that he could continue to make money. If you go back to our poll, the answer is PR and protect the money and also cover up what really happened. It's not really privacy. Privacy is sort of part of it, but not really, right? Okay, so now let's go on a little bit. Did you know that in 2021, so I've just said to you, the main reason for all of this covering up is to make money. Did you know that in 2021, last year, the seventh highest earning dead celebrity was Elvis Presley? He made $30 million last year in royalties. Quite a lot of that actually came from income from Graceland. John Lennon, in contrast, earned about half as much during the same period. Michael Jackson made 75 million, more than double in 2021. Any idea how he died? Prince made $120 million, pretty incredible, in 2021. Did you know that Prince died of an opioid overdose? Number one earning dead celebrity, anybody know? It's a British children's author. Anyone know who that might be? That's it. Roald Dahl. Well done, Bilby. It's quite incredible. So the number 2 is Prince at $120 million. Roald Dahl is like more than triple, more than 4 times as much. He made $513 million, a children's author, $513 million. That's like $500 million in 2021. Just shows you, write books, guys. You can make a fortune. So you can see why varnishing the king's image, his crown and his throne, had tremendous incentives around it. It wasn't now so much that Elvis was going to make or lose money. It was everybody around him, his father, his manager, his daughter, right? So the reality is, despite what was actually said officially in terms of the autopsy, in fact, drug use was heavily implicated in Presley's death. That's according to the writer Guralnik. The pathologist conducting the autopsy thought it possible that he suffered anaphylactic shock brought on by the codeine pills he had gotten from his dentist, which he was known to have a mild allergy. Now, is that that's not a contraindication, or is that? Is that a contraindication, or what would you call that, Stephanie? Having a mild allergy to codeine pills, right? And do you notice those words? He got those pills from his dentist. Remember, I suggested that Elvis's visit with Ginger to his dentist hours before his death. That's what's happening here. This was at 12:28 a.m. returning from the dentist. Let's see if I can get a better image. Yeah, that's the last photo of Elvis. That's Elvis returning home. You can see some other people are there as well. So he actually got codeine pills from his dentist, even though he was known to have a mild allergy against them. So do you remember me saying, I don't know if he went to his dentist because of toothache. Probably he went, and it wasn't entirely innocent. Yvonne says, I've always liked Dahl. Codeine causes constipation. I didn't know that. KD says anaphylaxis could cause cardiac arrest, but mild allergy doesn't fit with anaphylaxis, which is severe. Unless he had a severe allergic reaction, which, yeah. Okay. According to Wikipedia, a pair of lab reports filed 2 months later. So I guess in October, August, something like that. 2 months later, strongly suggested that polypharmacy was the primary cause of death. One of these lab reports, obviously it's a toxicology report, reported 14 drugs in Elvis's system. I think one's got to emphasize 14 separate drugs, 14 different drugs in Elvis's system, 10 in significant quantity. So saying that, this person saying right in the beginning, drugs played no role, but they pump his stomach and they get rid of the contents. Do you think that was very honest behavior there? Sharon says, I'm allergic to codeine. I didn't know that. Corporal Deb says codeine is metabolized into morphine. So to have 10 drugs, 10 different drugs in significant quantity, that takes some doing. Imagine taking, I don't know, 10 aspirin, or I don't know, 5 aspirin, and then 5 of something else and 5 of something else, because you've got to have the quantity in significant amounts. So to have 10 different drugs in significant quantity is not just that you took one. It means you've got 10 drugs of which each one is significant quantity. Polypharmacy, yeah. So I don't think the autopsy scenario is that complicated, although I think the interactions are. It's not a question of what evidence there is for neglect, deteriorating health, and toxins in the body. I think it's a question of how much of the vast piles of pills to include, right? In 1979, some of you are going to recognize this name, forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht conducted a review of the report. So 2 years after Elvis's death, you had Cyril Wecht looking at these autopsy reports. Somehow he was able to access them, and he concluded that a combination of central nervous system depressants had resulted in Presley's accidental death, right? So he's saying that it was the depressants in the cocktail that led to this accidental death. Again, I'm going to ask, was his death accidental? From his doctor's perspective, from Dr. Nick's perspective, would you say Elvis's death was predictable, preventable, natural, or accidental? Did you know that Elvis had an enlarged heart for a long time as well? So someone with an enlarged heart is already in a risk scenario for having heart complications, right? According to Michael Baden, he's a pathologist, he's a forensic historian. He said, you know what, things are quite complicated here. Elvis had an enlarged heart, that and his drug habit caused his death. But he said he was difficult to diagnose, it's a judgment call. So you got already all these different experts saying, actually disagreeing with one another. You've got all these different experts saying, I think it's this, I think it's that, I think it's more of this, right? That's also why Elvis's death is so strange. Like we don't know for certain what was going on. It's quite bizarre. Going back to this Wikipedia article, it says, quote, the competence and ethics of two of the centrally involved medical professionals were seriously questioned. And I think that's a reference to the dentist and the doctor, right? So when you say that, you're saying not only are they not doing the right thing, but they are legally, there are legal questions around that, right? Francisco had offered a cause of death before the autopsy was complete, claiming the underlying ailment was cardiac arrhythmia. Listen to this, a condition that can only be determined in someone who is still alive. You can only say someone died of cardiac arrhythmia if you found that they've got cardiac arrhythmia to begin with. We've also ascertained now that he denied drugs played any part in Presley's death. It's like Elvis is taking 3 suitcases worth of drugs where he's going is, just eating drugs like M&Ms. Did drugs play any role? No, absolutely not. So in this article on Wikipedia, they say allegations of a cover-up were widespread. You've got to ask yourself, who's covering this up? Who's been covering things up all along? Who's been covering things up all along? Covering up tends to be associated with culpability, and a few people were culpable, hence the series of lawsuits that followed. In 1981, a trial of Elvis's main doctor, George Nicopolis, exonerated him of criminal liability for his death. But it turns out, and now this is another reference to how much this came out in court. In the first 8 months of 1977 alone, this doctor, also known as Dr. Feelgood, prescribed more than 10,000 doses of sedatives amphetamines, and narcotics, all in Elvis's name. And so now you're going to say drugs had no impact. Well, I guess if you're going to tell a lie, tell a big one. Serge says anybody can edit Wikipedia. Wikipedia is nonsense. It's all crap. Maybe you should go to another channel then, if it's all absolutely nonsense. Wikipedia is fake news, totally, blah, blah, all of that kind of thing. I see you said the same thing again. I don't know, do you want to say it again? Anyway, so we're going to do are we going to do a calculation of 10,000 doses in 8 months? I don't think we are. Anyway, so the doctor's license was suspended for 3 months. So I guess because this is from Wikipedia, that's not true. So his license wasn't suspended for 3 months. It was permanently revoked in the 1990s. This is from Wikipedia, so I guess it's not true. So I guess, wow. So they refer to an article, so I guess that's also not true. Anyone can say anything. Okay. I don't know. So his license was permanently revoked in the 1990s after the Tennessee Medical Board brought new charges of overprescription. So to be honest, when I was researching this, I had no idea. It's like, okay, just what is the final status of Elvis's doctor? Is he guilty? So it's like, no, he was acquitted. He was guilty again. So like, what's going on? I'm confused. Like, just what is the bottom line here? So I guess if the final nail in his medical coffin was the permanent rescission of his license, then I guess he was ultimately seen as culpable. But it took 26 years ultimately to punish Dr. Feelgood. Just think about that. It took 26 years to take away his license. And he was involved in numerous legal appeals, and each time he said, in every time he appeared, he would say, I cared too much. Do you think that's right? Do you think he cared too much, or do you think he cared too little? So I mentioned this earlier, but did you know that according to Wikipedia, block your ears, sir, you don't want to hear this, probably fake. Did you know that according to Wikipedia, under the section legal battles, in 1980, Nicopolis was indicted on 14 counts of overprescribing drugs. That was to Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and 12 other people. So it's not just something really horrible, something really, questionable going on with Elvis. It's with 13 other people. Interestingly, the district attorney ruled out murder charges because of the conflicting medical opinions about Presley's cause of death. Katie says you could easily verify that by looking at the doctor up on the medical board side. Yeah. Thanks for that, Maria. Okay. So think about it. Murder charges are actually in the offing here. It says here the district attorney ruled out murder charges, but that means they were actually considering bringing murder charges, right? So who would you say was more in charge of taking care of Elvis? His doctor or his manager? What do you guys think? Let me say that again. Who would you say was more in charge of taking care of Elvis? His doctor or his manager? Do you see how many really interesting questions come up in this legal, true crime, and others? It's a really interesting kind of analysis and investigation, even if I say so myself. Ricardo says doctor. Corporal Deb says his doctor. Yvonne says doctor serial killer. Okay, Liesel. So far, all of you are saying his doctor. Kelly Cat says both. Tommy says, I like Wikipedia. Bilby says, doctor, but both really. Sharon says, no one. Julie says, to be fair, the nurse who was employed by Elvis, that's also a good point. It's not the nurse is all, but by the way, the nurse didn't actually want to give him anything on the very last day. Stephanie says, the doctor's authority to prescribe, not the manager. Okay, sorry, where's Stephanie's? There. Yeah. Pauline says, I'm going to say his manager. A listless Elvis would be a useless Elvis. Yeah, that's a good point. Katie says the doctor's ultimately responsible. Pauline says Elvis. Okay, so think about this. Dr. Feelgood only became Elvis's permanent physician in 1970. So Dr. Feelgood was only on the scene for 7 years. The Colonel was there since, I'm just trying to think, it was in 1954. But basically, if the doctor was there for 7 years, the Colonel was there for about 3 times as long, right? For about 20 years. So that's just something to bear in mind. Does someone who has been your partner, your manager for 20 years have any responsibility towards you? Right? And do you remember in the movie, I don't know if you guys saw the movie. I'm just trying to get the picture of Tom Hanks. Do I have it here? Thought I did. Where, Tom Hanks, where are you? There. Do you remember how Tom Hanks said, you and I are the same? Well, you would imagine that if you say that to someone, you know, we are the same spirit in two people, we soulmates, that if your fates are so intertwined that you're actually going to care about this other opposite person. And I think that is actually true. You're supposed to care. But then you can make the argument, does his addiction disqualify him from caring? Can you say, well, because he's addicted to gambling, he's compromised to the extent that you can't really blame him in a way, unfortunately. Okay, so now we go back to Wikipedia. Those who don't like Wikipedia, close your ears, because all of this is fake. It's all, you can prove that it's not true. In 1994, the Presley autopsy report was reopened. It's quite interesting. Joseph Davis, who had conducted thousands of autopsies as the Miami-Dade County coroner, declared at its completion, quote, there's nothing in any of the data that supports a death from drugs. So even at this point, they're saying drugs have got nothing to do with it in a way. He says, in fact, everything points to a sudden violent heart attack. So it's amazing that in 1994, it's almost like, despite having all the information, that they're almost saying the same thing. It was a heart attack. It's got nothing to do with drugs. I mean, think about this statement. There is nothing in any of the data that supports a death from drugs. Do you agree with that? There's nothing in any of the data that supports a death from drugs. And this is from 1994. So you might say, oh, there was just a bit of a cover up in when it happened. You know, they were just covering things up and then later on they weren't. Well, bear in mind, Elvis Presley's foundation, whatever, made 30 million last year. So is there still an incentive in all of that? It's a question. So going on, this is going further through Wikipedia. Again, Wikipedia is just, do not believe any of it, just close your ears or head to another channel. More recent research has revealed that Francisco did not speak for the entire pathology team. That's quite shocking. So it's only come out recently that when Francisco made this announcement right in the beginning, he wasn't actually speaking for everyone. He wasn't even authorized to speak for everyone. And so it says here, quote, other staff could say nothing with confidence until they got the results back from the laboratories, if then. It's interesting, hey, Timmy? So do you guys think that that is a reasonable statement to make? That how can you give a press conference while the autopsy is being taken place? The document hasn't even been written or completed or signed off. And the other staff are saying, we couldn't say with confidence. Now think about, this is quite a complicated autopsy in terms of the toxicology. It's actually very complicated because of all of these different drugs, right? And now someone is coming forward saying drugs have got nothing to do with this. You haven't even seen the toxicology, right? So I agree with that they say we couldn't say anything with confidence until we got the results back from the laboratories. Even then, could you say anything with confidence? And they go on to say that would be a matter of weeks. In other words, they're saying we would only be somewhat confident in our assessment after a few weeks that was the impact of that substance or whatever. One of the examiners, Eric Muirhead, could not believe his ears. So one of the autopsy guys was a guy called Eric Muirhead. He said he couldn't believe his ears when Francisco made this announcement. So let me put that quote up. Francisco had not only presumed to speak for the hospital team of pathologists, he had announced a conclusion that they had not reached. In other words, him saying he died of a heart attack and drugs had nothing to do with it, he's saying that's not true. That was not our conclusion. So can you see how there's like this weird war of medical examiners on the issue of Elvis's autopsy? Strange, isn't it? And you kind of got to wonder who was getting these medical examiners to possibly behave in a strange way, if anyone. Did someone just decide, I want my 15 minutes of fame? Or did someone else say, I need you to say this? Okay, so it's pretty shocking, isn't it? Early on, a meticulous dissection of the body confirmed that Elvis was chronically ill with diabetes, glaucoma, and constipation. Going on with the quote here, as they proceeded, the doctor saw evidence that his body had been racked over a span of years by a large and constant stream of drugs. Who knew? They had also studied his hospital records, which included 2 admissions for drug detoxification and methadone treatments. So bear in mind, your job, if you perform an autopsy, you're kind of a investigator, and your investigation doesn't begin and end with the body on the autopsy table. You've also got to go and do some research and investigation yourself, contextual. You've got to go and look at medical records. Remember I said you don't actually need to look at the autopsy report. You don't need to even know what's in the autopsy report to make quite a rational, reasonable judgment. Remember I said that right in the beginning. Yeah, you've got a pathologist saying exactly that they referred to previous medical records. So think about that. The autopsy results are announced prematurely. So they kind of say, Elvis died of a heart attack and drugs weren't a factor. Oh, but by the way, we're sealing the autopsy report for 50 years. Now, I'm going to say, I don't know if I understand this 100%. According to the Mirror, the autopsy was carried out the same day. We know that. But the report was immediately sealed for 50 years by the family. And then they go on to say, sparking a slew of speculation as to what killed him. Now, what I don't understand is, as far as I know, the reason that the autopsy results are sealed is actually because the Presley family requested a private second autopsy. And when the family does that, they have the option to seal the record. So I don't know whether they're talking about the second autopsy reports that are sealed, or whether if you do have a second autopsy, that sort of immediately and automatically encapsulates the first. Just don't know this case well enough to sort of prognosticate in that way. We do know that some of the autopsy reports are sealed, and they're supposed to become available on August 16th, 2027. Vernon signed off on the autopsies being sealed. Vernon obviously had an interest in that, but one wonders who advised Vernon to do that. Well, who do you think? Who do you think advised Vernon on those autopsy reports? Do you think it could have been this person? Well, not Tom Hanks, but that person. I also think it's really interesting that you have the family requesting a private second autopsy. That already shows you, wow, did they not agree with the first autopsy? I don't know when they requested it, but did they not agree with it? But a second autopsy is already showing you that there's kind of something weird going on here. You had double autopsies in other true crime cases as well, like Rebecca Zahau. You had 2 autopsies. I think Cyril Wacht was involved in that. You had 2 autopsies also in Nora Corrin as well. I'm trying to think of other cases where that was the case as well. So why was the second autopsy not completed, or completed but not released? If it turned out that he had a heart attack, why not just tell the public Elvis died of a heart attack? You've actually already told it. I think it's because what's in the autopsy shows that he didn't just have a heart attack. Do you agree with that? To decide to seal the autopsy means that what is actually in the autopsy isn't going to say he just died of a heart attack, and it isn't going to say drugs played no role. Do you agree with that? If you've already announced that to the media and the autopsy results just going to tell you what you already know, then there's another reason why you're not releasing the autopsy results. Do you agree with that? Julie says, I bet you're right. I bet Parker told Vernon it was for the best. I think Vernon was genuinely in bits. Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going. According to the Mirror, quote, Dan Warlick, chief investigator for the Tennessee Office of the State Chief Medical Examiner, what a mouthful, attended the autopsy and fueled the popular theory that Elvis died while straining to go to the toilet, right? And I think that's probably why, if that's in the autopsy, bear in mind this guy, Dan Warlick, he attended the autopsy. If he's of this opinion, and it's going to say in the autopsy report, Elvis died while straining to go to the toilet, you can imagine someone who, like this, look, can you see he's actually wearing a Elvis pin? Someone like this is very worried about Elvis's image, because Elvis's image is going to have an impact on how much he earns. Well, Elvis dying while straining to go in the toilet, that's something he doesn't want the public thinking about or talking about. That's essentially true. It's not a good look. I think Elvis did die while straining to go to the toilet. So you can see why you wouldn't want that spoken of or thought about. And now the autopsy plot thickens. Warlick once said, quote, Presley's chronic constipation, the result of years of prescription drug abuse and high-fat cholesterol gorging, brought on what's known as Valsalva's maneuver. Put simply, the strain of attempting to defecate compressed the singer's abdominal aorta, shutting down his heart. Right? So that is how he imagines it, is that as he sat down, it could also be as he attempted to defecate immediately that caused him to have a heart attack. You can imagine that's not a great look for this huge celebrity. Then there's another guy, a guy called Joseph Davis. He said, the position of Elvis's body was such that he was about to sit down on the commode when the seizure occurred. He pitched forward onto the carpet. Okay, so that answers the question. There we've got that answered. So the floor was carpet. The question is, was there wood under the carpet? He pitched forward onto the carpet, his rear in the air, and was dead by the time he hit the floor. So the act of sitting may have fatally compressed a stool and his heart. So this is a really good, and I tend to agree, from Joseph Davis. He says, if it had been a drug overdose, and I've always thought drugs are a big part of it, but not necessarily what he died of, if that makes sense. Elvis would have, if it had been a drug overdose, Elvis would have slipped into an increasing state of slumber. He would have pulled up his pajama bottoms and crawled to the door to seek help. It takes hours to die from drugs. None of that happened. Elvis didn't pull up his pajama bottoms. He didn't crawl to the door. He didn't try and seek help. He didn't take hours to die. I just wonder whether he may have slipped into an increasing state of slumber, and while asleep, while unconscious, some internal clock mechanism failed. And so Elvis pitching forward, he was dead when he hit the floor, but he may have died while in a state of sitting. Again, one would have to demonstrate that to prove it either way. So just a reminder, the autopsy results are supposed to be unlocked in 2027. But there's a California physician, a guy called Forrest Tennant, that's got the following review. According to the Mirror, quote, the California physician who actually reviewed the autopsy report, so it is someone who's already seen it, he said, even the autopsy report wasn't enough to explain the long list of maladies that afflicted the rock star. So he's saying, I don't know if I agree with the autopsy report. It doesn't explain all these other things that were going on. In other words, the, what do they call them? Pre-existing conditions. So this is going back to the Mirror, quote, first he complained of vertigo, back pain and insomnia, eye infections and headaches. And in 1973, he was rushed to hospital in a semi-coma and found to be suffering from jaundice, severe respiratory distress, marked swelling of his face, distended abdomen, constipation, a gastric bleeding ulcer, and hepatitis. That is quite a combination. This is all in 1973. 2 years later, he was hospitalized again in 1975 with high blood pressure. So his high blood pressure is not just, oh, he's got high blood pressure. He's hospitalized with high blood pressure, also with high cholesterol, and a condition called megacolon, where the large intestine becomes distended, and that allows toxins to flood the body. He also had 4 near-death overdoses, 4 of them. So I guess the 5th, whether you want to say it's an overdose or not, was drugs were part of that. So you could say, I guess 5th time unlucky. How many times must you overdose before you say, maybe I should be careful? He had 4 near-death overdoses. Elvis had 4 near-death overdoses that left him unconscious and in need of resuscitation. Did you guys know that? He needs to be resuscitated, brought back from death 4 times. And so they tried the fifth time and it doesn't work. Again, if Elvis is not going to realize what's going on with him, who should be realizing that? You know, his client needs to perform. His client needs to go on stage. So his client's nearly dying. Who should perhaps be intervening in this? His heart was double the normal size. Despite never having smoked, this is also from the Mirror, he also suffered from emphysema. And I think you could hear that emphysema in his final performance. You could hear he was slightly out of breath. Even to some extent when he was singing, you could hear he was slightly out of breath. So this rhetorical question is posed in the Mirror article. What caused all of these disease processes in his stomach, liver, lungs, heart, spine, eyes, and bowel, right? Do you think it was drugs doing all of that? And notice in all of these ailments, nothing is mentioned about toothache. Remember, he's supposed to go to the dentist the night that he dies because of a toothache. Toothache's not mentioned anywhere in the narrative, nowhere. So this Californian physician says, and this is a really interesting theory. I don't know if I agree with it, but I find it really, really fascinating. Stephanie, let's see what you think about this. Again, quoting from the Mirror article, quote, Forrest, this California physician, believes that what actually happened to Elvis stemmed back to a serious head injury sustained in 1967, so 10 years earlier. So he's saying when Elvis knocked his head 10 years earlier, triggered a progressive autoimmune inflammatory disorder. In his opinion, as shared in a 2013 medical paper, so he actually didn't just think this, he wrote a medical paper on it. He said, when Elvis tripped over a television cord and knocked himself out on the bathtub. Now, I'm just not quite sure, did that happen on a film set? I mean, how can you have a television cord and a bathtub unless they were filming him perhaps inside his home, but maybe it was a movie set. Anyway, he trips over a television cord, knocks himself out on the bathtub, and the injury is so severe that it caused brain tissue to dislodge and seep into his blood circulation. That's what is being theorized here. So what do you think is the consequence of that taking place? So this little piece of brain tissue is inside Elvis's body. It's sort of floating around. This is almost a mirror version of the stool or excrement that is, once it's floating around, it's sort of plugging a certain organ. And so Elvis's body identifies this brain tissue as foreign and starts producing antibodies to destroy it, triggering, I don't know if you've heard of this, hypogamma globulinemia. Let me try and say that again. Hypogamma globulinemia, hypogammaglobulinemia. I think that's it. I got it. I'm not going to try and say it again. Have you ever heard of that, Stephanie? She says, I think it can cause seizures. Roses Are Red says a brain bleed. Jackie Abel says, poor Elvis, so sad. Yeah, I think while we're talking about this, one's got to feel for Elvis. It just feels like it's so unnecessary and so unfortunate, doesn't it? Actually says it's a floating bit of clotted blood. Yeah. So what are the consequences, I'll try it one more time, of hypogammaglobulinemia? Hypogammaglobulinemia, it's that middle part. Hypogammaglobulinemia, hypogammaglobulinemia, a disorder of the body's immune system. You try and say it. At the time, little was understood about autoimmune conditions, so in 1977, but today they are known to cause most of the symptoms Elvis displayed: chronic pain, irrational behavior, obesity, enlarged and diseased organs like hearts and bowels. So he's saying that this piece of brain that was floating in his body caused inflammation and a reaction that got worse and worse and worse and worse. And this is the reason for it. And it's a kind of a disorder of the body's immune system. In 2016, a retired homicide detective, a guy called Gary Rogers, also a forensic coroner, told the Huffington Post that with these findings in mind, he would have attributed Elvis's death to a heart attack caused by heart disease and drug use caused by an autoimmune disease, which is sparked by a brain injury. So it's that whole equation that I provided, but autoimmune disease at the beginning of it. So let's reiterate. Autoimmune disease. Now let's start right at the beginning. Brain injury, autoimmune disease, drug use makes it all worse, heart disease, heart attack. So it's all of these a series of unfortunate events. I think it's an interesting theory. That's my opinion. I don't know if I like it very much because of this idea that you can almost say that an innocent disorder explains all of this ill health. Because I think you've got to look at all of Elvis's behavior that's not, I don't want to say it's not innocent, but it's problematic. I think you've got to calculate in the massive amounts of drug use. I don't think you can say he had some other disorder and that's really the cause. It's just too simplistic as far as I'm concerned. So I quite like what this forensic coroner says, Gary Rogers, that I suppose you could add this as a complicating factor, but I don't think it's necessarily relevant. I think it's enough to say that he had health problems, one of them being constipation. He was taking a huge amount of drugs, and this worsened his constipation, and he had heart issues, and that led to a violent heart attack. Does that make sense? Do you guys agree with that? So I'm not going to go terribly much further into this, except to say, even the aftermath of Elvis's death, I mean, beyond the autopsy, was pretty crazy. Did you know that Elvis's body was exhumed? According to the Daily Mail, Elvis was supposed to be interred next to his mother, and he was, in fact. And it's quite a short paragraph in the Daily Mail, and they just say that Elvis was interred next to his mother until a fear of grave robbers forced the family to move both graves, his and his mother, to a meditation garden at Graceland, and that opened to the public in 1982. That's not the full story. In fact, on August 29, 9 days after Elvis's burial, 3 men were arrested after trying to steal Elvis's body from his mausoleum. And these men were Raymond Green, Eugene Nelson, and Ronnie Atkins. They were all caught sneaking around Elvis Presley's burial site. Let me see if I can bring that up. Is that this article? There it is. There it is. Stephanie says conditions snowballing out of control. actually says, did you say someone tried to steal his body? Yes, and so did the New York Post. Thanks a lot, Matt. Appreciate that. Yeah, I feel the same way. um, so apparently these guys were trying to steal his body. Apparently, you see, it says here, nab 4 with explosives near the mausoleum. The suspects were seized outside Forest Hill Cemetery. Received tip-off, 3 seized in car. And they were actually trying to, they thought they could get into the mausoleum by blowing it up. And they had a small amount of explosives with them. But a cemetery employee said that although they had explosives with them, it didn't actually seem like they had enough to do the job. And then the case actually went to trial. Again, you might say, what does this have to do with true crime, Elvis Presley? Answer, a lot. So Ronnie Atkins turned witness on his fellow conspirators. And believe it or not, after all of this, the charges against all 3 men were dropped, right? Despite quite a serious thing. And the problem was because the star witness was determined to be unreliable. He'd previously been arrested for fraud. So going back to the Daily Mail, quote, we filmed the funeral motorcade, a dozen white Cadillacs, Elvis's favorite car. By now, the Americans had caught up with the rest of the grieving world. 80,000 people lined the streets. And I reported that there were many people in Memphis who did not believe that Elvis was really dead. And let me see if I can bring up this article from Salon. There it is. This was published, was it 8 years ago? The Elvis Presley cover-up, what America didn't hear about the death of the king. Right? Yeah, they talk about an effort was launched to protect the reputation of the hospital that had treated him. Colonel Deb, thanks very much. Hypogammia is a problem with the body making enough antibodies. They help fight off infection. Also can cause respiratory problems. So what do you think, Corporal Deb? Do you think that's a dead ringer for what happened? So this to me is the big reveal. This is the big wow moment to me in this live stream. How long have I been at it? Almost 3 hours. So maybe now is a good time to say something that's going to make you go wow. And Corporal Deb says yes, part of it. So I think you guys are going to go wow when I tell you this. So, and it's amazing how when you do research and you're trying to put together a narrative, you start asking simple questions. And a very simple question I had was, I want to see Elvis's bathroom. It's quite a simple question. I want to see Elvis's toilet, right? It's the obvious question you ask in true crime. You say, I want to see the crime scene. I want to look at the crime scene. I want to examine it. I want to get a sense of its proportions. I want to get a feel for what we're talking about. And have I showed you a picture of Elvis's bathroom? I've told you where it is. I've showed you other pictures inside Graceland. I've explained that that was where he was found. I've shown you what do you call it? I've shown you kind of a graphic, right? But have I shown you a picture of the bathroom? Ali Grenade says, or what's it? Ali Grenade says, this is why I'm obsessing over the toilet bowl. Actually says, I've already used up my wow limit. Good to hear. So this is the part that I hope is going to make you guys kind of gasp. Are you guys ready? This comes from the following website. It's just an ordinary website called Cheat Sheet. I think I'm getting really tongue-tied. Corporal Deb says, no, you've not showed us. Thanks a lot, Sunflowers. So here we go. This is quoting from Cheat Sheet, which in turn is getting the information from the Express. Quote, during a tour of the facility, a Graceland employee said, as reported by Express, that the area upstairs has remained untouched since the day he died. The same record he was playing on his record player remains on the turntable. There's also a styrofoam cup that has remained in the same place from the day he died. I would love to know what is in that styrofoam cup. Was it coffee? Was it just a glass of water? Whatever. People magazine reported that only one celebrity had made it upstairs, Nicolas Cage, married to Presley's daughter, Lisa Marie, for 2 years, from 2002 to 2004. Is one of the few people invited to see the private suite of rooms. Are you guys ready for it? People magazine reported that Presley's master suite, including the bathroom where Elvis died, and that's within the suite, is off limits to visitors, right? So nobody gets to see basically whether you want to say the crime scene or whatever. And why do you think that is? Well, here's the answer. This is the wow. Keeping this private area closed was, here it is, to avoid any macabre attention at the scene of his death. Right? So what is that actually saying? It's to avoid bad PR. It's to avoid people thinking about where he died. It's to avoid the conversation we're having right now. It's to avoid the reality of Elvis's death, so that you kind of just go, I don't know how he died. I wonder how he died. And that's why there's so many conspiracies. So even the Elvis whatever don't want people thinking about it, talking about it. And that is why you can look online, as I did. You're not going to find any photos of Elvis's bathroom or bedroom because they simply don't exist, right? You can't imagine it because I'm talking about you can't look at the toilet, look at the bathroom and kind of think that's where he died. That's not available to you. The best you've got is this. And isn't that quite an elaborate PR stunt for the past almost 50 years to say we are never going to let the public see his bathroom. We're never going to let the public even see his bedroom. We don't want them to imagine that. We just want that excised out of the whole conversation, sanitized out of the conversation so that we can make more money out of it. So the same disconnection from reality that you kind of think about with the Colonel being addicted to gambling and Elvis being addicted to drugs, you kind of have this idea someone's addicted to money, and so they want us not to be aware of the reality here. We must not know and not imagine what actually happened right at the end. But if you just think critically, you can. And if you dig and research, you do have a very, very clear description from certainly Ginger Alden. And I sort of wonder, did they try and prevent her from publishing her book? Because that is very descriptive. So I'm almost done. I did actually mean to go even further. I'm almost finished. I'm about to wrap up, but I didn't mean to go a lot further. In this episode, I wanted to do a deeper dive into context, going into 1976, going into the book that was written and all of that. So that I'm afraid we're going to leave for the next episode. I'm not actually sure what we're going to do in the next episode, but the next episode isn't tomorrow. It'll be Monday. But I was thinking I do want to talk about the woman in Elvis's life, specifically the last woman in his life who actually got a lot of sort of haters because they felt Ginger should have saved him. And so she wrote a book about him, but I want to deal with all the women in Elvis's life, because I think that just that perspective, putting that needle in to the story, is going to reveal a lot of other things that just bring this whole story to life even more. So I hope you guys feel that you're learning a lot in every successive analysis. I hope you feel you've learned a lot here, things that you just didn't know. So I'm going to sort of start concluding. I'm going to start sort of wrapping up. I want to share with you guys a personal insight into how constipation and painkillers work. And this is how I do it. When I was in my late 20s, I lived in the UK for a little bit more than 2 years. And towards the end of my stay in the UK, I did a medical trial. I was a guinea pig. I think in total I must have been a guinea pig 5 or 6 times in different hospitals. One's was, I think, Guy's in London. Another one I did for Smithkline Beecham. Another one I've done quite a few in South Africa. I certainly don't do them anymore. But this one I did in Ireland, and it was a morphine trial. And they were testing quite a high dose of morphine. And I think you stood to earn, trying to remember, I think you stood to earn £1,800. So I think that you got paid £600 per week, and it was supposed to be 3 weeks of floating on morphine, quite a high dose. So 1 week, £600, 2 weeks, £1,200, 3 weeks, £1,800. And I'd kind of researched all the trials going on, and I thought this is the one for me. And then, anyway, long story short, while this dose was being applied, I definitely didn't get a what do they call it? Placebo. I remember sitting down, and we were like in a communal room, boys and girls, or whatever, and watching TV. And at one point I saw 2 televisions, and I sort of concentrated, and then I saw one television again. And then I was just so sort of not, I guess, on a high or whatever it is, so drugged that I just allowed myself to see 2 televisions. I was like, it's just too much effort to see one television. And I can tell you that one of the symptoms I had after a couple of days was that I felt a weird kind of numbness, sort of from the waist down. I felt like just a sort of a deadness in my abdominal region. So I definitely experienced that, and that was just from morphine. That was just from morphine. It was morphine. That was what it was, but just morphine. I think it was 60 milligrams. I'm not 100% sure. Julie says, "You brave doing that drug guinea pig thing. If you said stupid, I wouldn't be angry with you. But there was a means to it. There was a reason why I was doing it. So I want to fully and finally conclude by talking about gambling in your life. You might say, well, Elvis was gambling with his life. Not a good idea. You might have said the colonel was gambling. I want to bring it back to you. I want to bring it back to me. 2% of America's population are problem gamblers. I wouldn't be surprised if it's more than that, but that's quite a lot. They're suffering what's been called a gambling disorder. it's gambling is an addiction that doesn't involve a drug, right? And what happens when you gamble is you become more and more solitary as you lose touch with reality. You become more and more isolated. And this is the part that I want to emphasize. Gambling is tied to anxiety. So the more anxious you're getting, the more you gamble, which results in more anxiety and more gambling. And so the end result of all that is that problem gamblers are at a greater risk of suicide. And I've actually written about this in detail in a book that dealt with someone who's addicted to gambling and frequented a particular casino in Vegas and then did something terrible. So I've actually investigated that in detail. And I think he became very isolated. I'm not going to mention his name because YouTube will probably demonetize me because it's that whole area of conversation. But the same thing is happening with you and your cell phone. The same way gambling is designed to prey on your susceptibility, it's also designed to make you addicted to your phone. And what is happening in gambling, and I love how this article describes it, it says, quote, "A solution to life's problems always feels just one spin away." I love that description. You know, like this idea that if I just spin the wheels one more time, everything may work itself out. I might hit the jackpot. My whole life will change. I'm going to then become a god and transcend life's problems. Do you think that that's realistic? In a weird way, the same thing happens when you kind of on your phone. I'm just going to look at one more thing on my phone and then I'm going to feel better or whatever. And you've got to try and see that that's happening. You've got to use your own discernment to see that that's happening. Actually says it's almost midnight yet, must be early morning in South Africa. It's 5:45 in the morning. So that's my spiel. I'm just trying to bring gambling to this idea of when you're on your computer looking at social media, there's a little bit of that same thing that's taking place. You're getting a bit of a hit. So I want to conclude by showing you this. Where is it? So this is a nice infographic or whatever, a illustration, I guess. And there you can see the pillars of Graceland. There you can see the bedroom. Remember there were two windows here. Can you guys see that? Just make it a bit bigger still. So yeah, there would be the windows, and there's the entrance to the bathroom, and there's the toilet. And I don't like the way this is represented. I don't think that's accurate. Elvis is actually facing the door, and I don't think that's accurate. I think actually he was sitting on the toilet, and his head should be here, and his rear end should be there. But nevertheless, this is showing you exactly where the toilet was and kind of what it looks like in a way. So this is giving you quite a sense of a picture of the bathroom and the bedroom that you otherwise would never see, and giving you a sense of a wrong sense of where Elvis was actually lying, right? So that's the one thing I wanted to show you. And then the other is this. So this is a picture taken of Graceland from the road. And so even from the gates of Graceland, you can actually see to where Elvis actually died. You can kind of see that it's sort of behind this tree, behind in this sort of area. The bedroom is over there. Stephanie says, weird spot for a toilet. So that is my spiel. I hope you guys have enjoyed this live stream. I know it's been quite grisly. I know it's been long and quite exhausting, but I certainly learned a lot researching it. I hope you guys learned something listening to it. Yvonne says, yes, I do that on my phone. Sunflower says, yes, with loneliness makes you want to connect somehow. So you kind of got to, you've got to, what I want you guys to do, the takeout I want you guys to get out of this, although we spoke about the autopsy, I want you to think about the impact of loneliness and anxiety in driving an addiction. And you then do something that you think is going to make you feel less lonely and less anxious, but all it does is it ends up making you feel more lonely and more anxious and more addicted, right? And so you kind of got to ask yourself, what is a functional way to be less lonely? And the answer is quite obvious. Speak or interact with a real person, right? Have a real interaction with a real person. How to be less anxious. Do something that is less addicting and more real and more authentic. Do something in the real world. Exercise. Take your dog for a walk. I don't know. Make kind of an artwork. Observe the world around. You can take photos, for example, but engage with the real world. Engaging with not reality is going to make you more anxious, going to make you lonelier. Do you get what I'm saying? Katie says, get out in nature. That's a really good point. Sharon says, you're an excellent teacher, Nick. Thanks a lot. Actually says, thanks, Nick. Great evening and wonderful message to end on. So I want you guys to be healthy. And if it means watching me less, great. But I want you guys to be healthy. I also want to be healthier. I'm also trying to, what's the word? Exercise more and, have some of these invigorating kind of experiences. And you need to have a balance in terms of, body, mind, and spirit. And you've got to ask yourself, it's such a great way of testing yourself is to say, is this making me more anxious or less anxious? It's such a neutral way of doing it. Am I becoming less anxious because of this or more anxious? And you should be becoming less anxious, but be honest with yourself. Are you or aren't you? Am I becoming more lonely or less lonely? And it's quite easy. How are you less antisocial? By socializing. How are you less anxious? By being with people that know you and like you more often, not less often, more often. Stephanie says balance is so important. So I want you to, when you think of Elvis, I want you to think of someone who, for whatever reason, lost that battle to some extent against loneliness. I mean, what he said to Ginger was, he said, sometimes I've been 60% happy, sometimes I've been 40% happy. Can you believe it? Elvis saying, I was only happy 40% of the time. I want to be 100% happy. Elvis eventually lost that battle, right? How do you win that battle against unhappiness, loneliness, anxiety? Only you can answer that question. But one thing you can tell is, I'm becoming lonely here. I'm becoming more anxious. So do whatever you are doing less. What do you think that is? Do what is going to make you less anxious more. I can guarantee you exercise is going to make you less anxious. I can guarantee you speaking more directly with people, not over the phone, where that person's in front of you, is going to make you more connected and more less lonely. So just think about that. Becky says, thank you, Nick, great live. Joan says, happiness comes from helping others. Master your thoughts. Corporal Deb says, I walk every day with my dogs. If you don't have a dog, get a dog. A dog's also a great way of introducing or reintroducing you to your doggy self. The person that sniffs and notices things and wants to be in nature, wants to go for a walk. A walk is such an important thing. A dog knows that. You may have forgotten that. I remember as a child going on holiday, and we couldn't wait to get up the next morning and run out and explore the beach, and see how everything fitted together, right? What happens to that when we get older? Our life isn't guaranteed. Tomorrow is not guaranteed. And there's a big world out there waiting for us. It doesn't matter how old you are, there's still a big world out there waiting for us. Quite a big statement from Beverly Lawyer. Elvis saved my life listening to his 45s when young teen. That's really interesting. Actually says, I was raised by dogs and horses. Stephanie says, what are the final poll results? Let's have a look. To cover up what really happened, 41%, that I agree with. I think the PR should have been a lot higher, potentially. You could even say the answer is PR. So that's definitely interesting. Actually says, this is very inspirational. Thanks. Pen Marie says, I go every year, usually for Elvis's birthday in January. That's interesting. It's good to have some folks that are really passionate about something here and getting something out of it. I hope you have gotten something out of it. Corporal Deb says, I've sent Sharon a video of upstairs Grayston for you. Thanks a lot. Okay, so that is it, guys. I think it's your bedtime as well as mine, even though the sun is coming up here, and I think it's gone down there quite some time ago. Can you believe it? I've been basically working flat out for 6 hours. So I don't know how my brain's going to switch off now. I think I'm going to need maybe another hour for it just to settle down. Actually says, I wish you had an option for all of the above. Even though certain things are all of the above, it feels like a bit of a cop-out. I feel like I do want you to choose one, and certain options are more true than others, or truer than others, right? Okay. Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, that was the correct title. You must be frazzled. I'm not really that frazzled, but I do need to log off. Okay, again, thanks a lot, guys. Remember, episode 26 of the Van Gogh letters, and I've got a surprise for you guys that I'm not going to tell you ahead of time, but something's going to happen in that episode that you're not going to expect. So should be a good one. So if you guys have been, some of you guys that are new to the channel watching Elvis, you might want to try out the Van Gogh letters. You might think, there's no way I'm going to be interested in that. Well, you might actually find it quite interesting. It's also very detailed, and we go into the psychology of one of the world's greatest artists, which Elvis was as well. Corporal Deb says, bye for now. Cheers, guys. Thanks again to the mods, the members, the subscribers, and all those super chats. Really appreciate it. But bear in mind, if you're watching the replay of this, you're welcome to hit the thanks button. It does come up only a little while after the live is played, so bear that in mind. Allah Grenade says it's a great series. That's good to hear. So we'll keep going with it. Okay. This is me signing off. I know there are 100 of you guys still here, but that's bye for now from me. See you guys next time.